All right. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're going to go ahead and call to order the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee meeting for Friday, September 25th. Let's see. I'm Ting Sun, Chair of the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee, and I wanted to thank you for joining us today. Due to the pandemic, today's meeting is being conducted virtually. I ask for everyone's patience as we navigate through today's meeting. This meeting is being broadcast through a live webcast. Interested parties can view the broadcast by visiting the California Workforce Pathways webpage and then click on the live stream link located under the 2020 Public Meeting Notices, Agendas, and Minutes. A recording of the webcast will be archived at the California Workforce Pathways webpage in about a week. I'm happy to announce that we have a new committee member from the State Board of Education, Jim McClellan. Jim is the Education Director for the Yurok Tribe. He has been involved with career technical education in the past and has participated as a stakeholder in the development of the federal Perkins 5 state plan. Jim, would you like to share a few words before we start?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well and taking care of yourself and doing those small things for our own wellness and self-care. But yes, I'm Jim McQuillan. In the Yurok language, you would say Ayakui or Skuyanukoi, good morning and hello. I'm a tribal member from the Yurok tribe and with Tolowa and Irish heritage. And I want to say happy American Indian Day. This is California Indian Day right now. Our tribal government is closed and celebrating that holiday that was proclaimed back in 1968 by Governor Ronald Reagan for California. So we're the first state in the nation to celebrate American Indians with having a Heritage Day. But my background, I'm a PPS credentialed counselor and an MFT, licensed mental health professional. And I currently oversee the California's largest tribal education program. We're the largest tribe in the state of California of the 120 tribes in California and over 560 nationwide federally recognized tribes. I have a very keen interest in career technical education. You know, I'm a father of 6 adult children and 8 grandchildren now. And I've seen the success of career technical education on our students and in my own family. Of my 6 children, 2 are CSU graduates. 1 is a UC Berkeley graduate. And then I have 2 sons who are heavy equipment operators who have gone to school to learn heavy industry and heavy equipment operation and work to bring out and take out the old logging roads up here in Northern California. I have 1 son who was attending community college working on his career technique. He was in a terrible accident. Everything is 2 or 3 hours away up here in Northern California, our colleges and community colleges, and he was trying to get to the school and had a terrible crash. But I'm happy to represent the remote rural counties in Northern California. Up here in Del Norte County, we have a lot of space and, for social distancing and people. It's beautiful. Like many of you, we're suffering with the smoke and the fires. And, I wish everyone well during this time where we're experiencing major crises on 2 fronts with the fires and the pandemic and the issues around social justice also occurring in our communities. But I just hope you're all well, and I'm honored to serve as a state board member and on this committee for career technical education. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. We're happy to have you join us, and your experience certainly is going to help us support career technical education in California. So welcome. Right. So we'll, before we begin the meeting, I have the following announcements to ensure that we have a smooth technical meeting. So first of all, members, please keep all microphones on mute. All attendance and motions will be taken by roll call. Committee members will use the raise hand feature in Zoom to be recognized by providing a comment or question, or if you even just kind of wave a little bit, Lisa will be watching the screen for me as well to be so I can recognize you. And we will ask the public for public comment for each agenda item, and again at the end of the meeting. Public comments can be made via Zoom, email, or by phone. All options are explained on the posted agenda. Today's agenda includes a presentation on our state initiatives, the CTE incentive grant, and the kindergarten through grade 12 strong workforce programs, including a detailed discussion on data metrics. We also will be provided an update on the comprehensive California state plan for CTE. So we must have a quorum to continue, and since this is a virtual meeting, staff will take attendance by roll call. So Lisa, if you will please take the roll call.
Yes, Chair Sun.
Here.
Vice Chair Grande.
Here.
Member McQuillian.
Yes, that was me, McQuillan. Yes,
sorry.
here.
I will get it right next time, I promise. Member Rawlings.
Here.
Member Rucker.
Here.
Member Salazar. I don't think she's on yet. Ex officio Member McGuire.
Here.
And I believe ex officio Member Rattray will be joining later as well.
Okay, so we have 5 members in attendance, is that right? It is now 10:54, and I will call the meeting to order. And before we move on to our agenda items, I will ask staff to announce staff who are supporting this meeting either at CDE or remotely.
Yes, we have myself, Lisa Reimers. We have Michelle McIntosh and Pradeep Kodamaraju from the California Department of Education in the building. At home, we have Sheni Weber and Sandra Sanchez from the Chancellor's Office. And we also have Stephanie Pappas and Rachel Moran from the California Department of Education, and Patricia and Pamela Castleman from the State Board of Education.
Very good, thank you. All right, so let's just begin with item 1, which is the approval of the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee's July 10th, 2020 preliminary report of action, our draft minutes. So we'd like to seek approval of these minutes for our July 10th meeting, and it was in attachment 1 for item 1. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Okay, moved by Vice Chair Grande. Second?
I'll second.
Second by Member Rucker. All those, and actually we need to do is there a public comment?
I am not seeing any at this time.
Okay, not seeing any public comment. We'll go ahead for a roll call vote.
Yes, Chair Sun.
Aye.
Vice Chair Grande.
Aye.
Member McQuillan.
I'll abstain from that vote since I was not at the meeting. Thank you.
Member Rawlings.
Aye.
Member Rucker.
Yes.
And Member Salazar is absent.
Okay, very good. So we do have a majority. So the report of actions for July 10th, 2020 meeting has passed. Okay. All right, I think we are now ready to move on to item 2. So for item 2, I'd like to welcome Pradeep Kodamaraju, Director of the Career and College Transition Division, and Michelle McIntosh, Administrator for CTE Leadership Office from the Department of Education, and Sandra Sanchez, Assistant Vice Chancellor of the Workforce and Economic Development Division of the California Community College's Chancellor's Office, to share an update of our state initiatives, including a conversation around the data metrics and recommendations. This is a lengthy agenda item, so we will take a break, take some breaks and lunch during this item. And with that, if there are no questions, we will go ahead and get started. So Dr. Koremaraju?
The agenda item, we'll give you a little briefing on particularly the CTEIG incentive grant, and you will hear from Sandra Sanchez about the K-12 strong workforce as well. Just to start the proceedings, what you have on your slide there is just an overview of the day for this agenda item. We will start with the CTEIG 2021 application, followed by an update for the kindergarten through grade 12 strong workforce program. We'll provide you summary data reports on the CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce. We'll talk about an MOU on the data sharing between the California Department of Education and the California Community College Chancellor's Office, but as it relates to these two programs. And then we will end with the recommendations on the 2020 CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce metrics. The first 4 bullet points are really information items that we will present to you. It is the last one, those recommendations on which there's possible action to be taken on that. So, and on the slide in front of you is basically the purpose of the Career Technical Education Incentive Grant. But just to give a background about CTE programs in the state of California, I'll go back to 2008, where they were categorical and a combination of categorical and general funds that were provided for CTE. In addition to that, to supplement those programs, we also had the Carl Perkins federal funds. But in 2008, there was the event which essentially led us into the Great Recession. And as a result of that, a lot of the CTE funding was reduced for several years. And it wasn't until 2013 that we started getting more funding into CTE through categorical funding. Basically, just around 2013, California moved into implementing the local control funding formula and also the local control accountability plan. And these categorical funding sources that I just talked about were essentially a bridge to the LCFF program, LCFF as it ramped up over the next several years from 2013 onwards. So the largest of these categorical programs was the CTEIG, the Career Technical Education Incentive Grant, and in 2015 the legislature provided $900 million that was spread over the 3 years. First year $400 million, second year $300 million, and third year $200 million. And the purpose for those was to encourage and maintain high quality CTE throughout the state of California. The CTEIG program was administered by the California Department of Education. In 2018, legislation was passed to basically split the $300 million into 2 separate programs, $150 million for the CTEIG program, but in addition to that, the legislation enacted the K-12 component of the California Community Colleges Strong Workforce Program. So the K-12 Strong Workforce Program started in 2018 with $150 million. And $14 million to provide technical assistance, and these funds were administered through the California Community College Chancellor's Office. These two programs work together to provide high-quality CTE pathways to California students and are supplemented by the federal Perkins funds, which this committee, the California Workforce Pathway Joint Advisory Committee approved and passed the Perkins 5 federal state plan, which has been approved by the U.S. Department of Education. So I'm sure you will have a lot more questions for us as we go through this program, Member McQuillan, and please don't hesitate to reach out to staff if you have more specific questions regarding these two programs in particular, CTEIG and K-12 Strong Workforce, but also in CTE in general, and we will answer your questions either virtually or in some other manner as well. So with that, I will turn this over to Michelle McIntosh, who will talk about the 2021 application for CTEIG.
Thank you, Pradeep. And good morning, members. My name is Michelle McIntosh, and I'm the administrator for the CTE Leadership Office. And my office is charged with administering the CTE Incentive Grant. So as you can see, the purpose of this program is to encourage, maintain, and also strengthen the delivery of high-quality career technical education programs throughout the state of California. For fiscal year 2020-2021, the CTEIG application was actually released on Monday, August 21st, 2020. I'll now take you through several of the updates that were made to the 2021 application. Updates include criteria for renewal grants, making sure that as we read these, we are adhering to the California Education Code, implementing streamlined process for renewal grants for those that received funds last year, allowing applicants to explain unique conditions. We actually gave them an opportunity to do that within the grant itself. We moved on from a paper application process to an electronic submittal process this year. We also made sure to include the 12 essential elements of a high-quality college and career pathway as reference for folks. So as they were answering their self-evaluation, that we wanted to make sure that they were keeping in mind the move to the new 12 essential elements. We also included information in the RFA regarding the technical assistance providers and the pathway coordinators that are available, and made sure that their contact information was provided through the RFA itself. Additionally, we added frequently asked questions that were created, and we actually posted those to the website as well as through the webinars. So now I'll talk to you about some of the webinars that we did. We hosted a total of 3 webinars, and of those 3 webinars, we had over 603 attendees, and we had an opportunity to answer over 200 individual questions during those 3 webinars. Specifically, the information that was included in the webinars included information about the funding distribution following statute, and to distribute the funding this round using the 140 or smaller ADA 141 to 549, which is the medium category of ADA, and 500, and those that have 549 or more ADA would be considered in the large category. For renewal grant information, we'll be looking at multiple measures, including the expenditures and data reported. As far as the application review process goes, there is a total of 52 points possible for the entire application this year, and 27 points are needed to be eligible for funding. We made sure to explain the appeals process within the webinars, as well as payment procedures once folks are awarded. This year we had 2 application review procedures, one for LEAs that received funding in 2019-20. So those would have been our renewal grantees, and then another process for those that did not receive funds for 2019-20. Basically what we did there is if they received funds for 2019-20, we gave them a little bit more of a streamlined process in answering the questions in their self-evaluation. The high quality CTE program evaluation and plan, we went over that and how to answer the questions there, whether you were a renewal grant or a new grantee. We also walked them through the budget narrative worksheet and how they needed to fill out the budget and what we would be looking for. We explained the 3-year budget plan that's required per statute, and also talked to them about the inclusion of the 2019-20 local control accountability plan, which specifically needed to have references to career technical education. We also walked them through the application preparation and submission process that they would need to follow, as well as provided FAQs. And those FAQs were updated as we went along and answered those questions, and then we just added even more questions to the next webinar and so forth. So as far as the timeline goes for the fiscal year 2021 applications, these applications were due September 17th. We received 389 total applications. Of those, 32 applications were ineligible because they were incomplete, and we are currently reading and scoring 357 applications. The proposed allocations will go to the November 2020 State Board of Education meeting, and following approval, grant award notifications will go out to LEAs in November 2020, with the anticipation of funds to be released to LEAs in December of 2020. I'd now like to open it up for member comments, questions.
Any members with questions?
Vice Chair Grande.
Vice Chair Grande?
Thank you, Michelle, for the information. I was just wondering if you might be able to provide us with a little bit more information about the applicants that were deemed ineligible. What component part of the application may have been problematic or incomplete?
Sure, thank you, Member Grande. So the application process, it's a 2-part process. The first part is they actually log into our program grants management system and provide us information through the system. The second part of the application process is they fill out a few attachments. The first attachment is the high quality CTE program evaluation tool. The second attachment is their budget. And then the third attachment is the 3-year budget plan. What typically happens is sometimes a lot of LEAs will go on with the anticipation of completing the entire RFA, and they may only complete the first part, which is the electronic piece in our PGMS system, and then they never follow up with the second part of the application. And then sometimes we'll have folks that will send in the second application or the second part of the application, but they didn't have the first part of the application. But this year it was mostly the folks that actually completed the first part but did not complete the second part. And we've emailed and also followed by snail mail with notifications to those folks already.
Did they happen to provide any indication why they may have begun the process but not completed it?
No, there's not an opportunity there for them to provide that information unless we actually talk to the applicants. There's not a place on the application itself to answer that. I do know that we had some applicants that didn't complete just because they, as they read through the RFA, they started filling it out and then realized they might be ineligible, or there's just a variety of reasons why they don't complete it.
Is there ever a follow-up survey provided at the end of the entire application process that queries the applicant about their experience with the application process so that we might be able to glean some information about those people who are eligible and have completed the application, what might have been potentially problematic that they overcome, so that maybe we could be a little proactive and solve some of those barriers for the applications that were not completed?
So we haven't done that in the past, but we can certainly do that this time around.
Thank you so much for your answers. I appreciate the responses.
Other member questions? Oh, and I want to recognize that ex officio member Rattray has joined us. Welcome. Okay, if not seeing any questions, I actually, oh, is there somebody?
Yeah, ex officio member Rattray has a question.
Okay, sure.
Again, I apologize for not being on time, colleagues. I guess just one question I would have is, we talked about at the last meeting, we all know that CTE and career education is even more adversely affected than traditional academic-based education in an online environment. And there's lots of efforts by folks all over the regions of the state and across the country trying to think about innovations, how to make sure that we don't even more adversely affect career education. I'm wondering, to what extent did you see, or are you seeing some of the applicants being really creative and making sure they take advantage of best practices and innovations that are out there versus just, sort of almost as if the application is the same they would have sent last year, which couldn't be like more different in terms of two different worlds from last year to this year?
Sure. So good question. So what we did is we gave them the opportunity, whether they were new or actually returning applicants. We made sure that they provided any updates to their strengths and their opportunities in the self-evaluation itself. And we also specifically, again, provided that area for unique conditions where they could tell us about maybe a situation or something that they were doing that would help us to better read and better, I would say, evaluate their application than what we had before. That particular piece was not scored, but we did put that in there specifically so LEAs would have the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about their programs to give the readers a better sense of the things that they're doing. And so we just started reading this week. We'll continue reading next week. As far as if there's new and innovative things, I haven't heard back from staff yet, really. They've just been really kind of focused on reading the grants so we can ensure we meet the timeline for the State Board of Education meeting. But I have told them, and we did say during our trainings, to make sure that they do look for those things if they're seeing some new and innovative things that are happening, so that we might be able to use those just for information or possibly best practices in the future.
Okay. Thank you. So I had a couple of questions. Of the 357 applications, Michelle, that you said, how does that compare to the number of applications we received last year?
It's actually right around the same amount. I think last year we had it was in the 380s that we received again. And then as far as reading, I'll have to go back and double check my numbers, but I believe we're actually reading around the same amount too. So okay. And I remember we awarded, the board awarded 336 applications the last time around. So we're about right where we were last year, considering the pandemic and so forth. So we're actually happy to see that we still have about the same amount of applications, considering the pandemic. We know it was also a tighter timeline. And so with that being said, we were happy to receive the amount that we did.
Yeah. I suspect that probably more returning reapplications rather than the new applications, just given that the pandemic. But so then are you expecting to award about the same amount as last year, around 330 some
Yes,
odd?
we're hoping so, if not more. So
Okay,
there's
great.
357 opportunities that we're currently looking at. So
Terrific. And then just a last piece, mentioned in the item itself, write-up itself, that there were some issues that came up last year with regards to the categories and some of those other issues. So can you explain a little bit of how CDE is going to resolve that for this year?
sure. So one of the issues was the ADA and the categories of ADA. We made sure this year to include in the RFA and really to make sure that we included in the webinars that we did how we were going to distribute the ADA, again, looking at statute, and that's how we came up, again, with the small, medium, and large categories. So letting the field know, letting LEAs know right up front that these are the categories that we will be going with. So that was well explained. The other issue, we had a couple issues with the calculation of ADA when it came to a couple of our LEAs. And because of the way the formula works in the grant, once you change one number for one LEA, it changes the numbers for all LEAs. So what we've done is, even though we're on a tighter timeline this year or this time around, we've tried to build in the time to make sure that we have the accuracy and that we're able to double, triple check the ADA numbers that will be put into the allocations.
Okay. So given that, so I may be off on so this would be the 1920 ADA that you would be looking at for
correct.
The 1920.
Correct.
So we're going to have to think about, since ADA is held harmless for 2021, how the next round of funding we want to look at ADA. Is that right?
Yes. Right. And so even for the 1920 ADA, I don't remember the name of the bill off the top of my head, but there was basically a hold harmless as well. We worked with our principal apportionment office that provides the ADA to us, because that was a question we had going into this round, was to ensure that LEAs that they weren't harmed because of the COVID, because of the loss of ADA and so forth. And so our principal apportionment office, we worked with them very closely, and they provided the numbers, which looked like we're pretty close to last year. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we cut off ADA calculations early in the school year last year. So there's just something to think about, actually. It just occurred to me as we're looking at other formulas that involve ADA. We know that there was this hold harmless this year, and how much of an impact, I don't know, but that's just something to be aware of.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. See, any other questions from panel members? Oh, so we have a question from Member McClellan.
Thank you. Good information to have. Do we have a sense of those applications, how the spread was from throughout the state, regionally or smaller remote areas, how they did in terms of their representation on the number of applications?
Thank you for asking that question, Member McClellan. We don't as of yet. Again, we just received the applications last week, but we are working on actually doing a mapping to map where those the applications are coming from, and then when they're funded, where they'll be funded, so that we can see what that spread is throughout. Number one, throughout the state, also both urban, suburban, rural, so that we can see where these dollars are going in the communities that they're serving.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
We have a couple more comments. Sandra Sanchez mentioned that bill is Senate Bill 117. And then we have a comment from ex officio member Rattray. He says, this may be more of a technical assistance opportunity. We should be helping with grantees within 2021. For example, how to do career education in an online and or hybrid environment.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And that is all I'm seeing at this time.
Great, thank you. Great comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions on CTEIG. Let's go on to the next item.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Sun and members of the board. My name is Sandra Sanchez. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for the Economic and Workforce Development Division for the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office. Today, I'm going to share with you a brief update about round 3 for the Strong Workforce K-12 program funding cycle, as well as a brief update about the activities related to ensuring that we have successful outcomes for our current and future grantees. Before I begin, though, I want to take a moment to provide you an update about changes to our staff. Recently, we assigned 2 new staff members to the Strong Workforce K-12 program. Katie Gilks is our new program specialist. Katie is a seasoned professional, and she brings with her a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the program. She has been monitoring programs and grants within the Chancellor's Office for over 20 years. And we look forward to leveraging her expertise to support the field and provide technical assistance to our K-12 TAPs and the pathway coordinators within the regions. We have also hired Lindsay Williams as our program analyst, and she comes from the private sector, and she will be working very closely with Katie as well as the TAPs and the pathway coordinators in providing the technical assistance to the field. And she has already hit the ground running as returning, ensuring that all of the information on our website is as current as possible, and of course, providing support to our field by responding to questions. Next slide, please. So on the slide, the next 2 slides, you will see the timeline for the current open RFA for round 3 of the Strong Workforce K-12 program. Our application portal was opened on October 27th of this year, and we have hosted a series of events in September, including a bidders conference webinar. The conference webinar had almost 600 participants, and it is posted on our website along with the most current FAQ about this round. In addition to that, we have hosted 42 regional engagement meetings across the 8 regions. We still have 6 more pending before the application cycle closes. And these engagement meetings are held within the regions, and most of those meetings are recorded and also posted on our regional websites. We are currently accepting and responding to any questions submitted via our dedicated email, and we are posting and updating that on a regular basis on our frequently asked questions document on our website. Next slide, please. Our application portal closes on October 16th. We expect that the regional selection committees will convene to review and deliberate and make funding allocation decisions by November 20th. We expect to announce preliminary awards the week of November 25th. And following that, there is an appeals period that runs through mid-December that allows folks who are appealing the process to make their appeals before a final formal announcement of awards is made. Next slide, please. So for round 3, what did we do different? As you know, at the end of every Strong Workforce K-12 funding cycle, our WestEd team reaches out to multiple stakeholders via applications, via surveys, focus groups to learn about participants' experience specific to the trainings, the outreach, the application process, the review and scoring and awards process. So we did this for after the completion of our round 2 to prepare for round 3. So for this particular round, we took into consideration the feedback that we received in early spring. We hosted 10 focus groups. We issued out 2 surveys that included applicants that were awarded and not awarded. Anyone who applied received a survey, as well as we conducted at least 5 one-on-one interviews from folks who made specific requests. From this, we made additional system upgrades to the NOVA system. We simplified the format for the project work plans. And based on the feedback, we expanded the character count to allow folks more room to make their compelling arguments within the application portal. We revised ADA per the legislation to not adversely affect the funding allocation due to COVID, which is the SB bill that I mentioned in the chat. And we eliminated in-kind match as an allowable match source, as it was brought to our attention that the legislation calls for a dollar for dollar match, and we are adhering to the legislated requirement. Next slide, please. As part of our continuous improvement process efforts for the Strong Workforce K-12 program, as I mentioned earlier, we engaged in multiple feedback sessions, and we established a criteria to adopt changes. So for our criteria this year, we prioritized making changes that reduce the administrative burden to applicants. So as an example, we streamlined the application, keeping the information needed for completing a successful application up front. We moved grantee-specific information to the appendices. And then, of course, the heart of the application, which is the work plan, will now, the applicants will actually submit that directly into our NOVA platform. We simplified the format with fewer cells to complete. And then, of course, we increased the character count for the feedback we got from the field. We also prioritized keeping our costs down. One of the things we looked at is if technology changes were requested, were they true technology changes, or was it a process change that we needed to make internally to facilitate the application process for potential applicants? We really tried to maintain continuity for repeat applicants. So we tried not to make extreme changes to the system so as not to confuse folks who had tried previous rounds applying for this round. And finally, we focused on what was important to the selection committee members to help them make informed decisions about what to fund. So what I'd like to do right now is take a pause and ask if the committee members have any questions related to the timeline and the changes made for round 3 application cycle.
Questions from committee members?
None at this time.
Okay.
Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So next, I would like to update you on the data collection efforts underway this month regarding the Strong Workforce K-12 Round 1 grantees. As you know, as part of our continuous improvement, our focus on achieving outcomes for the strong workforce, we initiated conversations with various stakeholders involved in this work to identify areas that can give us insight into what is happening with our current Round 1 grantees, and moving forward to allow us to ensure that we're making progress towards achieving our intended outcomes for this project for all grantees. I do want you to remind the members that we are using lagging indicators for measuring success for this program. Therefore, the field expressed an interest in sharing and learning from their current programs with positive outcomes they're achieving to date. Next slide, please. So on the slide, you see a timeline that shows the process we underwent in order to identify what would be important to capture. We started with our stakeholder input, and that included various leaders within the K-12 system, our Strong Workforce Key Talent, which is our technical assistance providers, our consortia leads, and of course, Chancellor's Office staff. As part of our discovery process, we identified that one of the challenges we are facing is that we didn't design our data collection system for this, and we needed to add this to the system to ensure that future data collection efforts are more seamless. Updates to the NOVA system are currently underway to provide ease of use for the field. Following that, we prepared a survey instrument. We utilized a survey instrument because we wanted to make sure to capture the information while it's still fresh in the minds of the first round grantees. And once our system is built out, we can add this in this data and then continue to aggregate the data in the system for future years. Next slide, please. In August, we made the survey live, and with the support of the statewide TAP and the regional TAPs, as well as the pathway coordinators, we have been assisting LEAs to complete the survey and submit the report. We expect to have all of the data collected by the first week of October. By the end of October, we also expect to be able to review and analyze the data and pull together a report about the progress of first round grantees. We hope to have the report completed by the end of November. Next slide, please. So one of the things we wanted to do was share with you what type of data we're collecting. We really tried to keep the survey very simple. Some of the items include the types of activities supported by the grant, total number of students enrolled in the K-12 supported CTE pathways by sector, total number of students enrolled in a strong workforce supported early college credit or dual enrollment program within the 1920 year. Next slide, please. So why are we collecting the data? Our intent is to improve our understanding of the impact of the grant over the course of the funding cycle. Please keep in mind that these awards are granted for 30-month cycles. So folks have a lot of time to do a lot of work to hopefully achieve outcomes. The platform, obviously, that we're using this time is an online survey. And what we've asked people, grantees rather, is to provide us with their ID numbers for their pathway in order for us to be able to match that in the NOVA system because, like I said, our system isn't fully built out yet. And the structure is the survey. And what we've tried to do in this survey is really align with the purpose and the strategies that were delineated in the grant application. And we hope that this will allow us to glean specific knowledge about the strategies and approaches and their effectiveness in achieving outcomes. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, the survey is due the first week of October. We did extend the timeline to increase participation. Each round, one grantee is required to respond. The survey is short. We are only asking 14 questions. And we are tracking who is submitting the reports on a bi-weekly basis. To date, we have 127 surveys submitted. Of the 826 potential grantees and partners that we have in the NOVA system that are participating in the round one grant cycle. So we have about a 15% response rate to date, and we hope that in the next coming weeks, as we get closer to the close date, we'll increase participation. Next slide, please. So what is it that we're asking the LEAs? The first part of the survey are questions related to identifying the project and their organization, and we had to do this because we're not currently able to feed the survey directly from our NOVA system in order to tie back the survey back to the correct NOVA projects. So in the future, this will be auto-populated and we won't require them to do as much work as we are this time. Next slide, please. So what is the core of the survey is really gaining a better understanding of what strategies are being used so we can gain understanding of what is yielding greater outcomes at the end of the grant cycle. The survey questions are a fixed number where the respondent can check a box. The questions are related to the main strategies they identified in their grant application. For example, if a grantee selected curriculum and instruction as a strategy, then they have options to select one or all of the following options: writing or modifying a course, model curriculum standards, procuring equipment and materials, etc. Next slide, please. As mentioned previously, we have mobilized the technical assistance providers and the pathway coordinators to assist the LEAs in completing the survey and ensure that we have participation from the field. Next slide. This approach to data collection has obvious limitations. The evaluation will be at a very descriptive level. It will tell us if the schools and the districts implementing the work that aligns with their plan. It will ask how, it would help us address the question of how is the work being implemented and where is it being implemented and how many students in pathways are affected by this work. Our hope is that the information will yield a rich understanding of programs being implemented in the field and will help us inform and better understand the nuances of student outcomes down the road. Next slide, please. So finally, if the members would like more information about the survey, we've provided the survey links here. and you can access those. So this concludes my presentation, and are there any questions from the members?
Thank you.
Vice Chair Grande.
Thank you so much for the information and presentation. I was wondering what plans we have in place to overcome some of the limitations that you just enumerated regarding the survey responses.
So what we are trying to glean from this is interim data, right? So our hope is that by ensuring that folks are utilizing specific strategies at the end, because we use lagging indicators, when we get to measuring the actual outcomes, we can start to identify what were those activities that actually helped us to achieve greater outcomes. So without having kind of an in-between check-in, so to speak, about what people are doing and how they're doing it, it's really hard to then look at outcomes data and say all of it worked, right? So we are trying to really get greater understanding of how this work is impacting the outcome. So we we did utilize the survey instrument. Like I said, we're happy to share it with you if you want to see what questions we are asking the field. They're very simple. It's about just getting what we call interim data about what they're doing and how they're doing it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm just interested now then with when we might have the full complement of data that goes down to the course level and the student level.
That is, I believe, what Pradeep is going to talk about when he presents on the MOU discussion. So I will defer to him.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Member McQuillan.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the great presentation. I'm just wondering, are there any questions or survey information that looks at more of the longitudinal information of how many folks later on go to work and actually become employed with the strategies? Thank you.
That is our goal as we are still negotiating our MOU data sharing agreements. Our goal would be to be able to track student outcomes to show us where we had, where participants actually were able to gain employment or attend some institution of higher education.
Other questions from the panel members? Scrolling through.
Dr. Kodamaraju has a comment.
Okay, thank you.
The other way to get to the survey, if you can't get it through the PowerPoint, is it's in the agenda item. So in the agenda item, the links have been provided there as well, and so you can click on those as well.
Thank you. Okay, I am not seeing any more. So I just have a general comment that when staff comes back for both the K-12 Strong Workforce Grant and the CTEIG grant, once the application, this round of applications come back in, to present us with maybe additional information about the breakdown of where the applications came from, who got, which ones were actually funded, what regions they come from. I think all of that is really good information for us to know, to see where there are concentrations and where students are benefiting from the grant funds.
Yes, we will know. Our application closes in October, so hopefully by the next meeting we will have a preliminary distribution. The challenge is that our awards will not be announced. Preliminary awards won't be announced till the end of November, so I think we meet, the CWPJAC meets before before we will actually know that breakdown, but we will be happy to provide the information as soon as we have it available.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, are we ready to move on to the next section of this presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm back to present the summary data that we've started to collect on CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce. So what we will be doing is we'll review the qualitative data that we've started to collect. We'll talk about the distribution of the CTEIG expenditures, and then we'll also provide you an overview of the follow-up data that we've collected for CTE completers and where they're going after they graduate from high school. I mean, I know the committee has been asking us to provide the members information about various aspects of these two programs in terms of both qualitative and quantitative data. And so we've actually reviewed some of the initial data that we've collected. We're starting to explore data collection approaches. We're also exploring methodologies, and then also different presentation formats to a non-technical audience. So what is being presented today is just a taste of how we can proceed as shown on this slide. But as Sandra was just talking about, there are many different directions to go on this. And in fact, the next, for this agenda item, we'll be talking more about data and how we can, so it's more, this is a retrospective look at some of the data, but the next two sub-items are actually going to be a prospective look of how we can collect the data. So to look at the qualitative data, we looked at the self-evaluation tool from that was provided in the CTEIG applications from 2018 to 18-19 and 19-20. So you have attachment 1 there, where the first 15 charts show how the LEAs are scored themselves on those self-evaluation criteria. So if you look there, you have 0, 1, 2, 3, and we looked at those self-evaluation scores that the LEAs provided to us and did some summary analysis on that. And that's on the next. The methodology that we used was essentially we organized the data in terms of chose a sample from the information that we had. We broke that up into the large, medium, and small categories that Michelle talked about before, using those three categories. And then we also, since we used a sample, we presented the overall sample average, and we also provided a statewide average. Since the programs are multi-year, we wanted to see, basically compared the 2 years for the same LEA. So the LEA applied in 18-19 and also applied in 19-20, and we used that as a way of looking at and making some judgment about their progress. And we chose, for simplicity, we chose essentially, basically, that we're looking at 2 and above in both the years. So they had to score a 2 in 2018 and score a 2 in 2019 and 20 to see which of those criterion showed an improvement. And that's on the next slide that we look at. So when when we reviewed the data, and we looked at areas of strength defined as an average score greater than or equal to 2 on the self-evaluation in both years. So for less than or equal to 140, and you have I've sort of summarized the criterion, but the related figures are indicated on the slide. And so you have for these small schools, so small LEAs, career exploration, support services, industry labor partnerships, experiential learning, alignment to labor market demand, and professional development. What this tells me, at least for the small schools, is they rely heavily on these funds to do the kinds of activities that they need to promote CTE within their LEA and within their community. Further, if you look at that what we're trying to do is the further analysis that we're trying to collect here is keep in mind that this is a self-evaluation score of the LEA themselves. We also have scores, and we will look at that going forward. We also have scores that our raters, those who have evaluated the grants, also have that, and we're collecting that information. And we want to see what the variance is between those two, what they self-evaluate on these criteria, and what we might think when we are evaluating those grants. And there's rich information in this self-evaluation data that we have, and the more years that we can collect, that we can see and make judgments about the change that might occur in these criteria. So when we reviewed the two years, the areas of strength defined as an average score greater than or equal to 2 on in both years are 80 for the smallest category. What they were looking for is essentially for the middle category, all we found was the ones in Figure 10, which is we're looking at equity nexus. In all of the other categories, the change was essentially below 2. So, and the same thing on the large category, there was no criterion self-evaluation that was higher than 2. But keep in mind, we wanted to make this simple because there were so many different directions we could go in this data. Keep in mind that even if they're below 2, that is, if they're between 1 and 2, they could actually be improving and moving towards quality. So 1, if it's approaching quality, and 2 is quality, and 3 is essentially where they're actually high performers. And we need to do a little more, we need to do analysis further to try and make those distinctions, not as Chair Sun talked about, in looking at both in terms of not only overall, but in where is it happening within the state of California. So the same thing when you look at this in terms of this slide, the same thing about average overall with sample average and the overall state average. So the broad conclusion that in our initial analysis is that depending on the size of the LEA, they tend to do better or quality improves in different categories. So not all of them are improving in those categories. And that then leads to the obvious result in terms of allowing us to provide technical assistance, as Member Rafi was talking about, because we can look at those and see where we can provide more general technical assistance and where we can provide more strategic or targeted technical assistance. The next set of data we looked at was simply in terms of expenditure, and I'll just leave the slide there and for you to look at and absorb that in terms of where the changes occurred in those categories. So basically, just an overview comment on this would be that there's a lag in some of the purchases, particularly like in industry and equipment facilities, because you really have to get your program going before you make those purchases. So maybe that's why it's higher in the second year than in the first year. So the third area that we looked up is what we call the follow-up data. So let me explain the methodology for what we did here. Attachment 2 you have provides a SNAP survey that essentially is a way we collected some of the information. Other information was collected within CalPads, and going forward, all of that information, this follow-up data, will be collected within CalPads. So then what we did is we classified, using the CDS codes, we classified the data by either the LEA got only CTEIG funds, or they got only K-12 strong workforce, or they got both CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce. And we then looked at and those are the graphs that you have there from figure 13, 15 to 15, figure 16, 17, and figure 18 in attachment 1. And so when you look at that, when funded by either CTEIG or K-12 only, but not both, marketing, hospitality, and health sciences are the top 3 industry sectors. When funded both by when they're funded both by CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce, marketing and hospitality still come on top, but other sectors come into play as well: agriculture, health sciences, and public service. So the idea here is we need to do some more analysis on this, but this is just so we can break this information down by the different industry sectors and then see what is happening in terms of where are they placing the emphasis. And it will be interesting to see, given the pandemic that we have, whether there will be any shift in this in the sectors that they choose. We also looked at whether the follow-up data, that is, the graduate essentially end up getting third-party industry credentials. Interestingly, when they're funded only by one of the either CTEIG or K-12 strong workforce, around 80% of the CTE completers are not acquiring third-party credentials. But when they're funded by both CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce, 2/3 of the CTE completers are acquiring a third-party credential. So this may be an opportunity where there are more degrees of freedom for the LEA in terms of providing additional credentials over and above the high school diploma to the student, to the CTE student or CTE completer, because of the degrees of freedom that they might have, because they don't have either they have both the CTEIG and the K-12 strong workforce, whereas those degrees of freedom do not exist when they're funded by only one of those programs. So I just went quickly through these, through the data, and wanted to know, and this was just an overview presentation of the data. There's a lot more work to be done in this area, and we just wanted to just give you a taste of this, and and if you have any comments about that, we can open it up for comments.
Okay, so a quick process question. comment. So we are bumping up against lunchtime, which is noon. And there's been a lot of information here presented, and I see members still squinting at their screen, looking at some of that information. So I wondered if we wanted to break now, or it really actually depends on the number of questions we might have. I suspect that once we get into the questions, we may end up going for a little while. So can I kind of get a sense from folks if we should break now and come back? I'm seeing some nods, scrolling through. Okay, so this would also give us a little bit of time to process some of the information that's there. It's in the attachments. So why don't we go ahead and just take this time for a break, and then when we come back, we will have member questions and comments for this section of the presentation. Does that work?
Yes. Thank you, Jean.
Okay. So we will take a 30-minute break, and we will come back, 30-minute break for lunch, and we'll come back at 12:30. Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you. And if you could stay on, but just close, you can turn your cameras off and your mics off. I would appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We are back and from lunch, and we will just start with a quick check to make sure that we have a quorum. So we'll do a quick roll call. Lisa, if you could, please.
Yes, Chair Sun.
Here.
Vice Chair Grande.
I am here. Thank you very much. It was a great lunch. I appreciate the break.
Member McKillen.
Yes, here.
Member Rawlings.
I'm here.
Member Rucker.
Here.
Ex officio Member McGuire.
I'm here.
And ex officio Member Rattray. And I hear you.
Here.
There you go.
All right, very good. So we will be continuing with item 2 on our agenda. And prior to lunch, we had a presentation of data that has been collected by the department and presented by Dr. Kogumrachu. And we are now at the point where for member comments and questions on the data. So do I have anyone who have questions, comments?
Vice Chair Grande.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Kogumrachu. I was wondering if we might be able to go back to slides 34 and 35 as my reference points. And I'm very interested in the data that was collected that indicates when a LEA took advantage of both the CTEIG and the SWP, that both marketing and hospitality sectors not only were the top 2, but also produced more of the industry valued credentials. Do we have any sense as to why those 2 in particular? Is it because they're easier to deploy at the K-12 level? Is it because they historically have been integrated into the curriculum at the K-12 level? Do they automatically have better interest from the student population? Do we happen to have any indication as to why marketing and hospitality? I'm just very curious.
I'll start the answer, but I will turn it over to Michelle too if she has any thoughts about that, given because in terms of having looked at some of the information from the evaluations. But I think the first thing is simply I would argue that let me take the third-party credentials first. Those are what I would call would require payment for those, where students who either the LEA would have to purchase those either in a class so that students can take that, and so the fact that they have both funding sources as I said, gives them more degrees of freedom. With regard to hospitality and marketing, I think we'd have to do a little more research into why that is the case in terms of choosing those 2 sectors. I would sort of wait till we actually go back into the data. But as far as the third-party credentials, I'm just thinking that when they have both funding sources, the LEAs have more degrees of freedom, are able to incorporate the use of those third-party credentials within their programming. Michelle, anything you want to add? But we can go back, and then this is one of the things, this slide particularly, I would say, intrigued me as it did you, Vice Chair Grande. And I think it's something that we need to go back and look at the connection between the choice of the industry sector that they have chosen, and in terms of those credentials. But one thing, it's interesting to, other than the culinary in terms of hospitality, there are very few credentials in marketing in terms of out there. So those may be two separate questions as to why they're going into industrial or choosing industrial credentials, and why they're ending up in these two, marketing and hospitality, as the top two industry sectors.
Yeah, and my question would be, does that match the actual needs of the economic and job market needs of that region or area? And, is it one of those where they had already built programs around marketing and hospitality, and that's the only choices that students have? Or is it really meeting up with the needs?
That's a good question. And as I said, this was to give you a taste for what we potentially can do. And I would stress the word potentially, because as you will see from our subsequent presentation on this agenda item, the work that we're doing with CalPADS in trying to collect this information is going to be critical to try and answer some of those questions more systematically.
Certainly, this is a great start. This is more data than we have seen thus far on this committee. So I really applaud the staff and the work that you've done in collecting the information and putting it in a way that in graphs and charts so that we can take a look at it. I think that as we become more sophisticated, and maybe as this information goes more onto CalPADS, we may want to get, how do I want to phrase this? We may want to get ahead of the survey a little bit, in that we want to, what is the information we really want to know? And that would drive more of the survey. It feels like we're just asking a lot of questions, and we had a lot of information, and we're organizing them, but was it actually telling us, I guess? And I think that's what we want to take a look at next. And I know we have our next section is on the matrix of metrics, and that might help a little bit for us to focus a little bit more what's really important and what we want to learn from the funds that have been expended both through CTEIG and K-12.
I think one of the reasons, as you saw from attachment 2, which is the SNAP survey that was provided to you, those questions essentially are the ones that are now being asked in CalPADS. But you are right in saying that once we move forward on the matrix of metrics and try to make those more concise and more consistent across the two programs, we have more opportunities to frame the type of questions that we want to ask. But in general, those questions that are in attachment 2 go back to some of the basic questions that were listed in the metrics in both legislations.
Member Rucker.
Thank you, first of all, Dr. Kodamraju, for putting together this data presentation. I believe some of my questions may actually be more related to what is coming in the next presentation on the matrix of metrics, but I am going to ask a couple of questions here. I, too, was fascinated by the information that is showing on this slide about the programs both in marketing and hospitality and health sciences that were some of the top 3 industry sectors. And so my question also is, are the programs being offered, or the programs that are percolating up as being among the top programs because these were already in existence and this is where the students went? Or are we actually looking at local needs and identifying local interests? Because this information really doesn't match up with what Tim Rainey presented to us from his presentation about what is going on in the labor market in California and where the gaps are anticipated to be. So while I'm glad to see that this kind of data now can be developed, can be mined from the information that is available in CalPADS, I think this goes further to inform, as Board Member Sun was saying, giving us, are we asking, this is giving us a lot of information, but are we asking enough questions or the right kind of questions of the data to help us understand both student interest and needs, as well as whether or not we're actually creating the types of CTE programs that actually will inform or fill the pipeline for the workforce, both locally and statewide. So I was very surprised to see this. As we go into the next iteration of doing this data mining, I think it might be of use and helpful to this panel if we take some time to look at the questions that were used in developing the survey and even suggest some other data questions that could be useful or helpful for doing the data mining, as well as looking at some ways that we can have some exit survey questions for the program participants down the road. So those are the general comments I want to make. And I also want to support Board Member Sun's assertion that this has been, the data conversation has been a long time coming. It's something we have asked for repeatedly at multiple meetings. So I'm just thrilled to see this information. I do want to think about how to be purposeful in developing the data and doing the data mining out of CalPADS to make sure that what we're seeing and what we're hearing about is more actually useful to our purposes and for us to be able to do the program evaluation. And I will hold any other comment until we see the second half of this data presentation.
Thank you. Any others, members on this? I'm just scrolling through.
Not at this time.
Okay. Not hearing any other questions. Thank you. All right, we can move on to the next section then of this presentation.
So this is the fourth sub area that we will be addressing, which is the MOU on data sharing between the CDE and the Chancellor's Office. I should preface this by saying that some of the information I present here should so leading into the matrix of metrics discussion. So going forward, I just wanted to put this chart out there for you to look at in terms of if you look at that chart there, we are now there has been significant discussion going on California's Cradle to Career system. I am part of a CDE team that is involved in that, and then there are, of course, so state teams that are looking at that from different agencies, which Cindy Kazanis from from AMARD is represented, as well as Mary Nicely and others. So just looking at that chart, so we have the California Cradle to Career system. Now, if you had that system, some of the questions that were being asked earlier could be addressed immediately through the process that is now being developed. But in the meantime, what we have is developing MOUs between the California Department of Education and the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office. They have been, and I've been involved in those conversations since I've been here, and particularly in the last 6 months. And there's a more concerted effort to have teams from the Chancellor's Office and team from the Department of Education meet regularly to talk about some of the relationships, data relationships that we need to look at. Right now, there is an MOU that exists between CDE and the Chancellor's Office, and they have several projects on that, and that's what that bottom arrow there is what we're talking about. And the latest one, what I heard from them is essentially, when I talked to Cindy, basically what is going to happen soon, I think, is an exchange of course data that includes not only basically it also includes CTE within that, so it will provide some additional information. But let me go to the next slide. And when we had these discussions with the Chancellor's Office and within CDE, there were sort of 2 points of discussion. One, could we include the CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce data relationship within the existing MOU that talks about the transfer of data between the two agencies? The feeling was that given the focus and the specificity, particularly the legislative requirements behind these two programs, it would be better to create a separate MOU with regard to CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce. So we're in the process of having those discussions. So the focus is going to be on those two funding programs. The student data, and here I've said it's limited to grades 9 to 12, and the reason for that is because of the next discussion when we have on the matrix of metrics. But the K-12, both these programs actually look at grades 7 and 8. We do have that course data, and we will make sure that when we have this discussion with the Chancellor's Office about how that data is going to be exchanged, grades 7 and 8 would be included within that discussion. The program data that is to be shared is CTE. As I've said before, other data is being shared with the Chancellor's Office, and they can be looked at in terms of so this MOU can be looked at as a complement to the larger MOU that I just referred to earlier. And the transfer of data is from CDE to the Chancellor's Office. And the reason for that is because both those programs look at essentially students in the K-12 sector, namely from grades 7 to 12. So what you have here is essentially looking at what you're looking at for compliance purposes. We are looking at transferring the data from CDE to the Chancellor's Office to meet the legislative requirements. But there is, as the earlier discussion pointed out, there is potential for analytics that makes it two ways. So you could actually look at, I think Member McQuillan was talking about this earlier, could be, since we now have several years of CTEIG programming and several years of K-12 strong workforce programming, can we create a longitudinal focus on that, looking at someone that comes into the CTEIG through the CTEIG or the K-12 strong workforce program and moves on into the community colleges and then moving beyond into the workforce. So there are opportunities here, and we are essentially going to be working in terms of this, getting this MOU ready. We've been having conversations both we've been having, the discussion is occurring at 3 levels: at the program level, with at the data sharing level, and also involving our legal offices. And so we are in the process of, I think we have a rough draft of that MOU, and those ongoing meetings will try to finalize the draft and make sure that we include some of the information, depending on your decision today, is to include some of the information that will be coming out of the matrix of metrics. Our intent is to have the MOU in place by the next application cycle, but I think hopefully long before that, maybe by the end of this year, but that we may have a better update to you about where in terms of how close we are to completion at the November meeting.
Okay, questions?
One question in chat from ex officio member Rattray. Shouldn't it also include A through G also, especially when it is part of a pathway and also academic side of the community colleges and ADTs?
Member Rattray, that's essentially the other MOU I was talking about, that's already in place between the CTE and the Chancellor's Office. So they already have that information in terms of inclusion. The question becomes is how do we then connect some of this data in terms of the analytics that we talked about before? But that information is there and is either being shared or will be shared over the next few weeks and months.
Thank you. And of course, I think you can all tell what I was trying to get to is if you have a health career pathway, and we've done a good job of making sure, say, a biology course is integrated with some CTE courses, and then it flows into a community college guided pathway that similarly has, let's say it's into an ADT pathway that has academic and career education courses. At a program level, that's nirvana. That's what we all agreed we want. So I'd hate to have the data not be able to be tracked that way.
A good point, Member Rattray. The question that one of the things is, at least when I've been doing this kind of work in terms of evaluation, when I was involved in a lot of the TAC evaluation, TAC grant evaluation before I came back to state government. And so one of the things that happens is I look at this at three levels. One is that you have what I will call just the facts, because the program requires you to present data in a particular manner. Number of completers, how many moved from one part to the next, those kinds of things. All grants tend to have that kind of information. Then there is the question of fidelity. How well is the program working? And how well that program is working is some of the information that you heard earlier in terms of the self-evaluation that is being collected in the CTEIG, some of the work that Sandra presented in terms of the surveys that are collecting, so we can sort of look at fidelity. The third piece, of course, is the analytics, which is quite sophisticated analytics, is asking a question. Is like the question we were talking about industry certifications. What happens when you have both programs, funded by both programs, and either funded by one or not funded at all? Can we get that kind of analysis? And for that, we require some more, both sophisticated tools as well as sophisticated individuals or skilled individuals that can do that. That for me, from my staff's perspective, is a longer-term proposition, but it's something that is the most intriguing, and we can move forward on that with the data we're starting to collect, as Member Rucker has talked about earlier.
Let's see, I'm scrolling through to see if there's any other questions from members. So I have maybe a systems question comment. I I think it's great that we're pursuing this MOU specific to CTE data and the data that's arising from these two grant programs. At the same time, I also know that within CDE, we've talked about this, that data is collected by different divisions sometimes, and the sharing of that information even within the department. And my understanding is that there is now kind of a department-wide task force of some sort where there's that communication so that there's that sharing of information with each other. So, I mean, an example is even just your division, Dr. Kodamarachu, talking to the accountability division, right? And sharing information through those means. So I guess where I'm getting at is as we are working on this MOU to share across the community colleges and in the Department of Education, we should, within each of our own respective, I guess, systems, really kind of know what all the data is and where all the data lies. And so that we kind of get that in order, so you know where to pull from information, or is there a clearinghouse of some kind or place within the department that you can go to so that we can so we're not piecemealing, I guess, getting this data from different places. So I'm just curious about that.
Thank you, Chair Sun. I think one of the ways, the data quest is one area that we can go to, but that's generally in terms for getting sort of basic information from the CCTD division perspective. We've made concerted effort to be in constant communications with not only AMART, the Accountability Division, we also are with EDMD, which is the division that looks at CalPADS, but also with TSD, because ultimately that also is in terms of trying to keep where the data is kept is equally important. So we are having these conversations. I'm thinking through the conversation that we have through this Cradle to Career internal committee that many of these issues have come up and will come up. And once we know where the Cradle to Career is going and how it's going to unfold itself, we would have a better idea of how CDE can collectively move forward, and not from just only from a division perspective.
Yeah, that's great. I've always been impressed with the community college system, and it seems like that is a strong clearinghouse for gathering all this information. So, I hope that we're able to maybe do something similar within CDE. And I think it would behoove not just this division to work through CTE, but other divisions as well, and other parts of the department. All right, no more comments from members. I think it's a Friday and we're tired. All right, let's move on to the next section then.
And we are getting to the most intense part of this presentation.
Okay.
Okay, so I will try to be general in this and maybe reserve a lot of it for specific questions to that. Basically, this recommendation of the 2020 CTEIG and K-12 Strong Workforce Metrics is attachment 3, the matrix of metrics, the Excel spreadsheet. I will give some pointers as we go through as how you could read that document and where you should be concentrating on. Hopefully you have that in front of you, but I tried to do the presentation in such a way that it would give you a fair indication of what these recommendations are, and for you to have a discussion about them. So what we will see as we move forward, we'll provide reasons for why the same recommendations are being made for CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce. Then we'll look at methodological and data collection considerations. And then we'll go through a step-by-step explanation of the recommendations for each metric and the underlying rationale for that. So just in terms of reading the matrix of metrics document, which is attachment 3, columns A to F are the CTEIG columns. Column G to K refer to the K-12 strong workforce. When there is the exact same information is in columns A to F as in columns G to K. And then rows 2 to 11 describe information on each of the metrics as laid out in both the legislations. Columns C and H indicate proposed revisions in the matrix, and column E and J indicate the methodology that is being considered and applied. And column D and G request acceptance of the proposed changes in metrics. That is that has been listed in column C and H. But the fundamental thing to remember, which is different from maybe previous presentations, is we are trying to essentially say the collection of data for each of these metrics should be the same whether you have the CTEIG program or whether you have the K-12 strong workforce program, and we'll provide the rationale for each of that as we go through. So the metric recommendations for CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce. The student population of interest is grades 9 through 12 CTE students completing an industry pathway. And so if you look at that, the rationale for that is the potential CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce grantees come from the same pool of LEA applicants. Both programs' data are reported through CalPADS, and the methodological precision or refinement that we'll talk about momentarily allows for analyticals within and across the programs. We've already alluded to some of that in previous discussion. So what's our consideration here in terms of what you have in front of you on this slide is simply the definitions that we would be using in terms of the 4-year adjusted graduation cohort is simply the pool of students from which we will draw from. From that pool, we will draw the CTE pathway completer as defined as such. And if you recall, this definition should be familiar to you because we spent a lot of time on this definition when we talked about accountability in the federal Perkins application plan. The idea being here is that the CTE pathway completer, the denominator for all metrics, will be the same, and so we'll have consistency across that. So the indicators. So the first thing we're trying to do is change the metrics, the language in the legislation that refer to metrics, into indicators, much like we did before when we were reviewing the federal Perkins application. The indicators are expressed in can be expressed as in absolute numbers or as percentages. Generally speaking, we tend to use the latter to account for differences in size and other variations across the LEAs. To express the percentage, you have to have a numerator and you have to have a denominator. The explanation of the use of CalPADS as the only data collection so going forward is for consistency. We'll be extracting all of this data, which now we're doing in a mixed way, through some of it through a survey and some of it through CalPADS. So even though we're asking for the same information, all of that will be entered by the LEAs into CalPADS, and there will be consistency and validity checks by the CalPADS office with regard to that data entry. And then that allows us to translate the metrics list in the legislation to indicators. So recommendation 1, the metrics, so what you will see for the next few slides is we've listed out the metrics, the metric from the legislation, and it's the same in both, and the recommendation, and provided a rationale for that. As I mentioned before, the metrics in the legislation says number of pupils completing CTE coursework, and that can be defined in many different ways. So in order to be specific about that, we are recommending that the metric be changed to the number of pupils completing the CTE industry pathway as defined previously that in a slide before, which is row 2, column C and H. And by doing that, not only does this allow us to have this indicator be consistent with use elsewhere in the CCI, in Perkins, WIOA, and many other federal and state efforts that are going on. So the rationale that it permits defining the denominator for all indicators consistently. Recommendation 2 is the high school graduation rate. There's no change to the metric in row 3, column C and H, but note the indicator refers to the number of CTE completers who graduate in 4 years with a regular high school diploma. That's what we are looking for, rather than all CTE students. We are being more focused about who graduates in CTE, and because that's the intent of the grant. Intent of the grant is to create a CTE student that goes through an industry pathway and is ready to move on either into post-secondary education or maybe into other kinds of post-high school experiences. Recommendation 3, which is in the legislation, it's the number of pupils meeting academic and career readiness standards as defined in the college and career indicator associated with the California School Dashboard. Our recommendation 3 will be subject to your determination of what the choice would be. And on the next slide, we give you the 2 options. Options for operationalizing this metric is to include the following. Use the college and career indicator definition in the California School Dashboard, which is essentially which only takes into account the prepared or approaching prepared. Alternatively, we could use the assessment proficiency scores for English language arts, math, and science. Our recommendation, we'll let you decide on this, but one recommendation, if you go with one, then we recommend we follow the CCI criteria as described in row 4, column E and G. Recommendation 4, which is essentially the number of pupils obtaining an industry-recognized credential, certificate, license, and other measure of technical skill attainment. Notice that actually is a compound metric. It has a lot of information in it. What we are suggesting here is essentially split out the compound metric into its own separate indicators, as we'll see in a moment. We changed the metric to in this case, pupils obtaining an industry recognized certification, which is row 5, column C and H. Recommendation 5 is the number of pupils obtaining, and again, the metric is exactly the same, but we're now separating out the work-based learning experiences. We want to change the metric to the number of pupils completing work-based learning experiences. Recommendation 6, the same thing, change metric to the number of CTE completers finishing college coursework. Row 7, columns C and H. So if you put those three recommendations together, recommendations 4, 5, and 6, the metrics for the legislation is as you see there, we want to operationalize that by using the CCI definition on the California School Board. We recommend subdividing the compound matrix, as I just went through, into those three separate indicators as shown in row 5, 6, and 7. So basically what we are saying is that the metric, it's that there's no problem with the metric in terms of being able and better measure that metric. We are asking for simplifying that compound metric and using the CCI definition. As you are aware, in the college and career indicator, and from the presentation that Cindy Kazanis gave to the state board a couple of weeks ago on the career indicators on the CCI, what I have just listed, the work-based learning and industrial certifications are under consideration to be included within the CCI. And so here the consistency across within the CTE in terms of how we include this information. That as we discussed when we were discussing accountability in the Perkins, what is different really is that the denominator is really CTE completers, whereas in the CCI, what one could be looked at in terms of the college indicators, it refers to all of the students, and in fact, it refers to high school graduates. We're expanding this to include all of CTE completers because we recognize that students complete CTE pathways through grades 9 through 12, most likely probably grades 11 and 12, but we're sort of making sure that we are more precise about the definition of that of those students. Metric in the legislation: number of former pupils employed and the types of businesses in which they're employed. This recommendation 7 is no change in the metric. We're just asking that we collect that, and this is the data that we actually used in some of the data reports that we had in terms of when we collected this information through the SNAP survey, and now we're going to collect it through CalPADS. Recommendation 8, if you again look at that, it's a compound metric: number of former pupils enrolled in each of the following: post-secondary educational institution, state apprenticeship program, form of job training other than a state apprenticeship. And we again recommend no change to the metric, except so maybe it's semantics here. We're not changing the metric per se, but we're saying the metric itself is subdivided into three separate indicators, which are to be collected within CalPADS, rows 9, 10, and 11, column E and J. So the summary, what I'd like to do is to give you the summary, and then we can go back through each of the recommendations, and maybe it would be an interactive discussion between the members and staff to talk about our proposed recommendations, each recommendation at a time. So the recommendation summary that we have here is that it's a change to the metric through redefining. So rather than looking at number of pupils in CTE, we're making that a lot more narrow and saying it's completing a CTE industry pathway, which is, in my opinion, should be what we should be looking at. And it aligns with other ways that we look at the CTE completion within programs. Change to metric through subdivision. Then that's those three. I won't read all of them, but it's really industry recognized certifications, it's work-based learning experience, and number percentage CTE completers finishing college coursework. The last bullet there, the number percentage of CTE completers finishing college coursework, is already collected within the CCI, and it's actually the quality indicator that that California has said it would be using for under the federal Perkins accountability indicators. So again, once again, we're trying to sort of move to having both collection and methodology be more consistent and methodology be more precise as we move forward. Change the metric to choice of alternatives. This is the operationalizing the college and career readiness. We're also saying the same thing for the previous three that I talked about. No change to the following metrics: the high school graduation rate, the number of former pupils employed, and the types of businesses in which they're employed, and the number of former pupils enrolled in a post-secondary institution. There's no change to that. And that last bullet, again, there's several ways we are trying to look at that in terms of collecting that, and hopefully through the MOU process and others, and finally through the Cradle and Career, we can get more precise about that particular measure, and then parse it out in different ways: community college, CSU, and others. And then it probably relates back to what Member Rattray was talking about, the A2G and others. So there are different ways of going about that. But in terms of the recommendation summary, the main takeaway from all of this is to say that we're having looked at the metrics in the legislations. What we proposed to you is essentially ways in which we can use our existing systems to collect this data and then also report them, and in the future do analytics about these as we move forward and collect more data for each of these indicators. So again, just to complete, again, there's no change to these metrics but the idea here is simply to make sure that we can actually get this information more with precision than we were able to even a year ago. So this is our recommendation, but let me go back and because there are a couple of places but I will start with recommendation 1. And I don't know how, Chair Sun, you would like to do this in terms of discussing recommendation by recommendation, or would you like to have a more general discussion? I leave it to you to make the decision on that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think how we want to tackle this is let's just start with any general questions about the matrix metrics, just because we've got a new member and there's some newer ones who may not have gone through this process of the evolution of the matrix as some of us have. And then I would like to go through each recommendation and respond to any questions and comments that members have for each one. And then we will take public comment, and then we will need to go back through, and I think then we take a vote by each recommendation, because they're they're different, and I don't want to just take it all at once. So it'll be a little bit of a process for us, but I think in the end we'll get a little bit better clarity if we do it this way. Okay, so let's start with just general questions about the matrix itself. It's a lot of information in one place. Anyone on that? Okay, good. My comment, I guess, when we go through each recommendation, what I will need a little bit more clarification on is when some of these instances when we are narrowing the definitions that was in legislation, are we also asking that changes be made in the legislation to match with our, or are we just?
So that is, we're actually asking you to make the change. That's a proposed in column D at H. That's really what we are asking you to do.
Okay, great. And then I have just more of a general background. There were, I believe, in this legislation references to the old elements for CTE programs, and we had discussed changing those to our new quality elements or our new elements. Was that done in any of the legislative sessions, or is that something that still more broadly needs to be done?
It's still pending, although we do make reference in the matrix of metrics to that, to the guiding principles and the 12 essential elements, but we didn't propose it as a recommendation, which I think we could be done, and we would need that to be done if we are going to use them within the application process going forward.
Well, yeah, and I think that whole idea was that we move to our new quality elements, so our principles, right? So we want to align that. We've had some conversations in the past about when would be the right time to make that change in the legislation so that we're referencing, so what we're doing, implementing matches what the legislation is. So I think before we go into the specifics of this, if perhaps this is the right time to do that, if it hasn't been done already. I thought there was a process of trying to get that in change.
Michelle has a comment.
Thank you, Member Sun. Yes, so in fact, we have talked with the Department of Finance and gotten some clarification from them as well as to when this needs to be done. So if we do want to change those minimum eligibility requirements, which were based on the old 11 elements, and we want to move those to the new 12 elements of a high quality college and career system, we can do that. That does need to be in the recommendation report that we make to the legislature and the DOF and other parties, but that needs to go in the November letter that we would send to them for the recommendations. So we can,
okay, very good.
So that could be a recommendation that when we meet in our November meeting, or we could put that in there. I don't want to jump the gun, but at the same time, that is something that the sooner we put it in there, then the quicker it will be enacted, because until that actually becomes law, we cannot put it in the we cannot put it in the application, right? Because the application is based on statute. So it could possibly go in trailer bill language for January, but then that may not get approved until June of next year. So it would depend on when our next cycle is. So I just want to give you that heads up of that's the process that it would take. So it would need to go in the recommendations and then become part of that trailer bill language. And then when the trailer bill language is approved, then that is when we would be able to implement that into the next round of applications.
Yeah. And that would apply also to these recommendations today. Is that right? It's the same.
I believe so, yes, because it's the same legislative cycle.
But in some sense, we are already starting to collect this information. So it's the relationship of the 12 elements to the application that is more critical in terms of trying to get that within the application. We're already starting to collect, and we collect some of these already. So and we do want to have it within the recommendation. But I think that doesn't stop us from collecting this information, because it's really information that we will collect based on the experiences LEAs have with the K-12 Strong Workforce and the CTEIG programs.
Right. I understand that. And I understand that staff is already moving forward with it. But hey, why don't we add that as an additional approval recommendation today? Since it has been something we've discussed quite a bit. It's not within the 7 or 8 recommendations you have right now, but let's add it in there so we can get it all approved, and then staff can move everything forward in one fell swoop, right?
We wanted to discuss that with you as we want to discuss other options that we have proposed, but we did want to discuss with you, and thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, very good. So let's now, since we don't have any other general comments.
You have comments.
Okay.
So, Member Rucker?
Thank you. So I have a couple of needs as we begin the work of digging into this part of the presentation and taking some action to vote. First of all, I want to make sure the next couple of sentences I say are probably going to contain some incorrect assertions, and I'm making them because I'm a little confused about what we're attempting to do right now. So we have data here that the staff are already moving forward to begin collecting. Is that correct?
Some of these are there. Some of these will be collected starting next year.
Okay. And so we also have some data relative to the program quality criteria that we have asserted should substitute or replace some of the old criteria, because this new criteria is more closely aligned to the essential program elements that we believe define high quality CTE programs. And so we are being asked today to approve what the staff is recommending. So separate from that, this is where I get confused. Separate from the steps we take to approve these data criteria, there needs to be legislation done and approved by the state in order to implement this criteria for the purposes of the programs that are funded for these projects. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so this is where I get confused. If I'm understanding what you said, it is possible that in this next round of legislative activities, as we saw that happened this year because of COVID-19, a lot of legislative policy was tabled for the year, and a lot of this work that we need to see going forward to inform the next round of planning for the next funding cycle, even if we take the steps to approve this, if it's not approved or added to the budget trailer bills or some other legislation, it still will not be added or inserted in the next round of either program evaluation or funding evaluation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be the case. It depends when we will release the application, because and so our conversations with DOF, they have suggested that we move forward with proposed recommendations and then see what happens. My preference is to have these proposed recommendations, because since it will take time and not wait, and at least I think knowing that this advisory committee has made this recommendation would give us more oomph in terms of talking to the field about moving to the new 12 elements and sort of getting them acclimatized to these specific recommendations and the data collection that we are doing, that we are now embarking upon. So I think by having them proposed now, and you're right, Member Rucker, we are not quite sure exactly what is going to be included in January and how that proceeds forward, but at least making these recommendations would be the right move.
Okay, so then based on that explanation, thank you. It helped to clarify some of the things I was confused on. As you were going through and making the presentation about each of these data elements, I did take a number of notes. For me, I have the need for each of the recommendations that you make, instead of approving all the recommendations in one single motion, I would like to consider the recommendations one by one, because there are some incremental adjustments or some fine tuning that I would like to propose with some of them as we go forward. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that. I know it's a lot of recommendations, and that would mean multiple motions, but I would not be able to vote for the motion in its entirety if we do all of them in one fell swoop.
Right. And that would be my plan to do that. Member Rucker, thank you.
Ex officio member Rattray.
Just one question. Again, I might be confused too in terms of exactly what the purpose is of the metrics we're referring to. Because I guess I'm wondering our grander ambition in our original charter was to bring more coherence to all funds that we spend in the state around career education, and not continuously being driven by any single categorical pot like Perkins or like CTEIG. And so that's why we led with our principles and with the idea that we want to have a way of knowing whether it's working regardless of where the money's coming from. Could even be Prop 98 funds. So my question just simply is, this sounds very precise and very well aligned to CTEIG and strong workforce. Is it intended to do that and only that? Or is it intended to make sure that it builds toward a pathway of working when we get to the big Uber master plan for career education? Is this going to be restrictive, or is it going to be enabling us to get there? So that's just my only questions. I just don't know if I understand the purpose of it enough, and then does it pass that?
Yep. Great question. Yeah, I think just a little bit, perhaps a little bit of history. So it is written in legislation that specifically names this committee to provide recommendations annually by a November date to any changes we would make to, or recommend any changes we make to the legislation for CTEIG and for K-12. Right. And we've been operating in this kind of grayish area. I was initially just gung-ho, yes, let's start making those recommendations now, because the legislation, of course, came before our principles, and I was ready to just say, let's get our principles in there. But we had a lot of other issues of how do we collect data? We were not as sophisticated and ready at the time. So there was a lot of trying to move forward with our principles, but then following some of what was already written in legislation. And I'm feeling that at least now with this meeting and these recommendations, we're starting to do exactly what Member Rattray was saying is, okay, are we now starting to tweak and shift our principles and our and shift this legislation more towards our Uber goals? And I believe that is what we are trying to do, and aligning with data that's already collected and aligning with the CCI, some of those other things. It does not mean that we stick with only these recommendations. We have this opportunity annually to expand those the metrics. So I would encourage that we would do that. I think we still need to, right now what we're doing is just kind of tweaking what existed there to align better with where we want to go. But we certainly aren't close, we certainly aren't there yet.
Member Rattray, just to add on to that, you asked whether this is going to be restrictive, enabling. In my mind, I think it's going to be enabling, because we're trying to make this more consistent across programs. So the focus is on the CTE student moving through a career pathway, starting as early as middle school and moving forward, and the programs and the funding sources, be they federal or state or even other types of funding sources that might be there, is really what would enable those students to succeed as they move through the pathway.
Okay, any other questions before we start digging into each recommendation a bit? Not seeing any. Okay, sorry.
No, I don't see any at this time.
Okay, very good. All right, let's go with recommendation number 1 then. So the first one, number of pupils completing CTE courses, change the measure to number of pupils completing a CTE industry pathway. Permits defining denominator for all indicators consistently. So do you want to maybe explain that a little bit? And this would be a recommendation in some language in legislation to CTE industry pathway rather than coursework.
That's the focus. And the recommendation is that it aligns with the CCI, because that's the CT, completing a CT industry pathway is one of the components of the CCI. And so it aligns with that. It also aligns with our definition of how we define the concentrator in the Perkins accountability model. As you recall, when we developed the Perkins accountability model, we took the state efforts that were going on, particularly the CCI and the California School Dashboard, to essentially build out those indicators, and we're doing the same here.
Okay. Any questions on this? Because the next time we come back, we'll be voting on it. So
I have questions on this.
Go ahead.
So the definition of what a concentrator is requires a student to take fewer courses than a student would be required to complete a pathway. So my concern is there will be a high number of CTE. My concern with this recommendation is that there will be a high number of CTE concentrators that will not be reflected in this data. Because you only have to take, 4 courses to be considered a concentrator, and many pathways contain more coursework than that. So I'm not sure that using the pathway is the correct term of art to use, because we will leave a significant number of concentrators across multiple industry sectors who are taking other types of CTE, who meet the definition of the federal definition of being a concentrator, but they may not necessarily complete a pathway for that particular industry sector, either because it's not available or because the student chooses to do something different. So I think it would be better to stick with the definition of concentrator for the purpose of collecting this data point, rather than collecting data only on students who complete a pathway.
So Member Rucker, if you go, I've gone back to the slide on slide 46, and right there you have a definition of a pathway completer, and that's the full definition. It's at least 300 hours. So that 300 hours will turn into a minimum of 2 or 3 courses, depending on how they do that. And I'll let Michelle to specifically explain that. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sure. Also, Member Rucker, the way that completers or pathway completers are collected is by looking at the capstone course. And so when they look at the capstone course,
okay, so Michelle, I'm going to stop you right there. That's my point. All CTE concentrators do not necessarily get to a capstone course, but they still meet the federal definition of being a concentrator. So my point is, I believe this definition, by focusing on completers, will actually eliminate a high number of students who otherwise are taking CTE courses who are concentrators, but they are not necessarily completing a capstone course. That's my point.
Right, and I think to your point there, so this is when we started collecting this for the CCI purposes, when we looked at the definitions of courses, because you can have a 1, 2, 3, 4-year course, right? So when you're looking at the single-year course, that's really kind of an introductory course. When you have a 2-course sequence, then we have told folks to label that as a concentrator and capstone, so they don't have an intro. Then when it's a 3 course, it makes it very simple because it's introductory, concentrator, capstone. And then if it's a 4th course sequence, it's an introductory, concentrator, capstone. The purpose of doing the capstone is because then you are getting the end of the full sequence that the student takes. So that's how it's collected for the CCI purposes. And if you're, and so the concern that I have, that I think I'm understanding you saying, is that there could be a student that maybe only takes 2 courses in a 3-course sequence, and then they're not going to be counted because they didn't take that capstone course. And
my concern that I'm raising is the same concern I raised when we approved this data element in the CCI, that in the way we were defining who would be counted for the CCI means that there are students who are taking CTE courses who will not be included in the data count for the CCI. So what I'm saying is, for the purposes of these programs, for the purposes of defining quality, for the purposes of defining the expansion and expansiveness of recruiting students and finding all students who are included and funded through these programs, we need a broader definition so that we are calculating and counting a broader number of students than we are currently counting and calculating for the CCI. That's my point. I understand what you're saying, but my point is, for the purpose of what we're trying to collect this data for, we need to be collecting data for a larger number of students than are what currently counted and captured in the CCI.
So, Member Rucker, what you're suggesting is that we actually collect, which is, if you go back to the metric itself, number of pupils completing CTE course, that could be a metric by itself, an indicator. Just have that, and then have a recommendation 1A or 2 to essentially take this new recommendation.
Yeah, so that's my point. There's a difference between how many students would be counted if we simply count the number of pupils completing CTE coursework and the number of students completing a pathway. That's a smaller subset of those students. So if our purpose is to understand who is in the program, where they are, and how many different types of programs are being populated by students, the simple metric is the number of pupils completing CTE coursework. If we collect the number about the metric about the number of pupils completing an industry pathway, we're going to go back and get information about hospitality, health sciences, and I forget what the other one is, because those are the largest number of pathways happening across the state. And we will not learn anything about any other types of CTE training or education going on, because it is the entire, again, going back to the presentation from Tim Rainey, the purpose of this specific metric is to understand our pipeline. So if we're not doing everything we can to make sure that all the students who are coming into the pipeline are identified and counted, we are narrowing down our own information.
Understood, Member Rucker. So could it be that we did 2 metrics? One would be the number of pupils completing CTE coursework, which would give us the largest number, and then another metric of numbers completing a CTE industry pathway. So then you have the larger participant number, and then you have the completion number.
Okay, that would work. And then the denominator then becomes the problem, because again, not all pupils completing CTE coursework get permits.
Yeah. So do we know how many students who are taking who are concentrators versus the number of pupils who are completing industry pathway? So, I mean, and the difference between that, because I do actually like the idea of collecting both information and to even be a little bit more sophisticated because we want to move the needle, right? That those LEAs receiving grant funds should be showing more students who are moving from the concentrators to the pathways, right? We wanted more movement of students who are in those pathways, and that's where the investment of funds should be focused on. So I think that we should collect both, and then we should also add some kind of a like an indicator of, in order for you to continue receiving money year to year, we need to see that you're moving the needle here.
Yes, and see, that's been the data conversation I've been having with Michelle, and what I've been asking her to give us is for these programs that are continuing to be funded from year to year, what are the gains that those programs are making in the services they provide to those students to increase what the students are actually doing in the program. That's the data point I keep asking for that we're not getting. If the only thing we're reporting is who's completing a pathway, we will never see all the rest of the students who are in that pipeline and know what's actually happening for them as well. So the two data points are important, but we need to be clear in adopting them what we're using them for or what the information is supposed to tell us. And so with that rationale about using permits as the denominator, we are still not going to get that information. So this was the one recommendation that I knew I wanted to do a deeper dive in, because we need to understand what this specific data point is not only supposed to be telling us at this level, but how it's supposed to define the priorities and operational decisions that districts are making at the functional level. And if we only focus on pathway, we're not getting that functional information.
So, thank you, Member Rockford. So I think we can split this recommendation into two, where we have number of pupils completing CTE coursework and then having number of pupils completing the CTE industry pathway. The issue still begs the question is what becomes the denominator?
I think we can live with that question as we move forward to operationalizing it or writing it into policy for the legislation. I think today the most important thing we could do is split the recommendation. And maybe when we come back in November, if you could do a data run to show us what those numbers look like, that might help us understand what the math is we need to do with it.
Yes, we will do that. Thank you. We've already started looking at some of that, and we'll do that.
Yeah. Now, we are actually a bit early. Is this right? So let me rephrase that. The staff is bringing these recommendations now in September, but we really don't have to make these recommendations until I think towards the end of November. So we do have an opportunity again, if we don't take action on a certain recommendation, to take that action at our next meeting in November, I believe. Mm-hmm. Is that correct for staff? Just we will still be able to make our time?
Yes, that is correct, except I think we're meeting on November 20th, and the recommendations are due November 30th at the DOF.
I see. Okay. So we can get it as close as possible, and if members are comfortable, we can take action today. If there are still information and there are specific recommendations, we can always then postpone that to the November meeting if we need to do that, so that people don't feel pressured, right? Okay. So any other questions, comments on recommendation 1 right now? All right, and we will be revisiting each of these recommendations again to take action after public comment. Okay, I don't see any. Let's move on to recommendation 2.
The high school graduation rate, we said there's no change in the metrics. We just have, again, it's still, we're looking at CTE completers, and it may be for this particular one, we look at the larger we can look at both. I mean, so we could get those who graduated on a CTE participant and those who graduated that they completed an industry pathway. So we have that. we don't have to make any change here. We're just, from a methodological point of view, we could do that internally within CDE.
Okay. And it does actually sound like that is a bit of what we want to follow a minimum definition for federal purposes, but for more aspirational California goals, we might want to track two types of CTE, the concentrators and the pathways. Okay, any other questions on this one? Okay, this one would not require any specific action other than implementation by the department. Okay, all right. Third one.
One is the metric in the legislation talks about college and career, academic and career readiness standards, and what we have proposed to you are these two options that are available to us, using that within, so we could use the college and career indicator definition and just use the nearing approach for the CTE completers. That's how this recommendation was done, but and it or could be broader, because what we discussed on recommendation one changes in the way the data is going to be collected, but what is the recommendation you want to propose in terms of the legislation, in terms of how we change and the proposed recommendation we want to put in place. It could be the reason I in my mind, this is a personal opinion, because we want consistency with the college and career indicator, my recommendation is to go with that. Although we have the assessment and proficiency score about English language arts and math, science we're just starting to collect, and obviously with COVID-19, I'm not exactly sure how those assessments proficiency scores are going to be rolled out. There's a delay in that as we move forward.
Do we have thoughts or comments on the two? I guess I'm not, can you go to the prior thing about what this is related to, back to the recommendation? Sorry, I've got a lot of things on my screen right now too.
The metrics from the legislation is number of pupils meeting academic and career readiness standards as defined in the college and career indicator associated with the California School Dashboard.
Okay.
That's why, since we're talking about the college and career indicator and the California School Dashboard, this particular recommendation is really focusing on college and career readiness. And as you know, up until now, and we'll be starting to collect more as we go through, both college and career components of the CCI. Right now, it's more the weight is more on the college side than it is on the career side.
Yes, right. I don't have any additional thoughts of this. Any other panel members as to aligning to the CCI, as that is what is basically says in the legislation right now? Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next one. Obtaining industry.
So this was one where it's a compound metric, and all we did here was to break this up into its subparts, and recommendation 4, 5, and 6 are that breaking out. And essentially, since these measures are going to be collected within the CCI, again, whatever we apply to a recommendation, whether it's to use prepared or approaching prepared, then we should be consistent across all of that.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, I do have a question. So there is, as we all know, the CCI is still maturing as we continue to add metrics to define the CCI. And remember, we're trying to create gradients about prepared or fully prepared and all that. And so this fourth recommendation, okay, that's and I guess I need to see the recommendation 4, 5, and 6 in there together to understand this. But this would be the number of pupils obtaining an industry recognized certificate. This would be students who, when they graduate, they would fall under the category of fully prepared. But the intention for the development of the CCI is that there would be this other measure of technical skill attainment. So Dr. Kodamaraju, as we look at recommendation 4, recommendation 5, and recommendation 6, how do those 3 recommendations together create the flexibility that was intended to define who these students are that would be recognized in this metric?
You are right about the CCI being high school graduates and then they're fully prepared. Based on leaving aside the discussion we had earlier about the recommendation 1 and what that denominator should be, the denominator is essentially all those students that complete a CTE pathway over between grades 9 to 12. So it actually expands. It's just not the high school graduates. It includes more than that, although the California high school graduation for overall is about 86%. And for these students in earlier data that I presented when we were doing Perkins is for CTE students, it's a little higher. So the question here is simply we are allowing for students that complete an industry pathway, let's say in grades 10, 11, and obviously in 12.
Okay. So I think it'll be important that as we go forward, as it relates to recommendation 4, 5, and 6, that has to be an all or nothing. You have to have all 3 of them, or you can't have any of them. Because given how you have broken up the on recommendation 6, I would actually like that to be the number of CTE, the number of CTE completers, because finishing college coursework, that's not a metric of technical skill attainment. That's something else. So yeah, so that's the reason why that's why I said earlier, I need to go through this because there's some incremental changes that need to be done. Recommendation 6 should just simply say the number of CTE concentrators, because that's what's directly related to the metric in the legislation. I'm sorry, number of CTE completers. I said that by mistake. The recommendation 6 should just say, in my opinion, the number of CTE completers. Because saying the number of CTE completers finishing college coursework, when you look at what the legislation says, that was not the intent of the legislation.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, that's actually, as I said before, this is actually one of the secondary quality measures under Perkins. So this is already there within the CCI. The other 2, 4 and 5, are just being and we're starting to have discussions and will be included within the CCI as we go forward.
Okay, but there's a difference between the number of CTE completers and the number of CTE completers completing college coursework. Again, that's a smaller subset. And again, if the purpose of what we're creating with these metrics is to give us a whole picture of all the students in the program, again, we would not be representing all of the students in the program. So as it relates to recommendation number 6, okay, so if we could skip up to number 6 again, recommendation 6. See, okay, actually go back to recommendation 5. So this is the number of pupils. See, this is the jump that's being made. Recommendation 5 is the number of students completing work-based learning experience. Notice, and that's not the number of completers. That's not the number of concentrators. The term of art being used here is pupils, because that's more expansive than just CTE concentrators or CTE completers, because we have a lot of students, and I was one of them, who did a work-based program, but I was not in a CTE program. So then when you go to the next recommendation, so that's very expansive. That includes all students, whether they complete a pathway or not, or even if they're in a pathway. Because the program that I was in was an internship in my county supervisor's office. That was not a part of any CTE program. Going to recommendation 6, the difference between what was the data collected in recommendation 4, recommendation 5, and what we're seeing now in recommendation 6 is this is a very small subset of all students in any kind of CTE program. That was not the intent of the information that the legislation intended data to be collected about. So you either want to bifurcate this recommendation and say we're going to collect 2 types of information about completers. The number of CTE completers who complete any kind of skill attainment certificate or license, or the number of CTE completers who also complete college coursework, because that's the college and career part. So that's a different data metric.
So if I'm understanding correctly, recommendation 5, basically, we're looking at the more expansive number of pupils that complete those work-based learning experiences. But is the question I have for you, Member Rucker, is the pupils that we're talking about those pupils that complete CTE, or is it all pupils?
Well, the way this is written, it's all pupils. So if we were collecting this when I was in high school, I would have been counted in that number under recommendation 5, and I didn't go through a CTE program.
Yeah.
We have to modify that recommendation, because my argument from recommendation 1 was that we were defining pupils as a CTE completer. And so given the discussion we had earlier with you on recommendation 1, it probably, what I'm seeing is in some recommendations, we may be more broad in the denominator. In some recommendations, we may be more specific in the denominator.
And so that's my point. That's the reason why I wanted us to go through this one by one, because there seems, the terms of art that you're using would capture different sizes of groups of students and different categories of groups of students. Yeah. And I couldn't tell if you were doing that on purpose or it was just not, being caught in the wordsmithing and the draft reviewing.
Yeah. I think what has I think we're convoluting some Perkins requirements, that the money that goes to specific types of students, to these 2 grant programs, really, which is to encourage and incentivize and to build CTE pathways throughout California. And so different ways of doing that is looking at, because, again, we go back to what is the purpose of the funding. It is to get more students technical training skills, as this particular indicates, that's not just for the concentrators. That's for so when we give money to an LEA, they want to get more students into some kind of a technical training coursework, so, and that would be successful for us, right? That would be one of the purposes of this funds. So I agree with Member Rucker that we're starting to, take other aspects, and I think we're forgetting what kind of the larger purpose of the grant program is and what we want to achieve with the investment of these resources. And so, I'm kind of uncertain. So recommendation for.
My recommendation for to take the argument from Member Rucker in terms of recommendation for, it is more. I think the likelihood is much higher that industry recognized certification that the student takes will be after they complete a pathway, and so that really is what. And that's an assumption on my part. I haven't done the research to find out about that, but the question then becomes, and maybe what I'm hearing from you, both you, Chair Son and Member Rucker, is that maybe the denominator needs to be expanded and include a lot more students.
It could be all students. It could be, the denominator could be all students.
I would recommend that it should be CTE students that in that as the denominator, and then if the intent is to making those students move to the different the pathway program, then that really is what because it's really the focus of the two programs is on CTE, so the denominator should be the CTE student, someone who takes a course. Then we want to know at least a course, and hopefully then we go through all of these measures and find out what they are for each of these different metrics that are presented to you. In some sense, we have the capability of doing both, looking at all CTE students and looking at just those who complete a pathway. My question to you is, this is legislative changes, so I think we need to be clear as to what we want to recommend for the legislative change that we want to give to the DOF. That's really what the question is, because all of the questions and all of the comments that you've made are addressable through a methodological approach that we can do internally within CDE and with the help of our partners at the Chancellor's office. But the question is really, how do we want this recommendation to look like when we send it over to the Department of Finance to be included in the trailer bill to change the CTEIG and K-12 strong workforce legislation?
Okay, so I recognize, and I apologize to my colleagues on this panel because I have really been assertive in expressing my concerns about these recommendations. I think it's important for the purpose of these two funding sources that we are expansive in the definition of the data that is being collected so that we are getting information about all CTE students and programs that are being funded by these two grant proposals, irregardless, notwithstanding, and not solely on the programs that result in a high number of students who complete a Pathways program. Because what I'm hearing from you is if we make these changes in the legislation, what will happen is that the only LEAs that will be successful in competing for these program funds are LEAs that have fully developed Pathways programs. And that disadvantages small districts or small programs that are actually wading into or being more expansive and offering multiple types of opportunities for students to explore CTE and begin, especially given that Perkins is encouraging states to start funding programs in grades as early as grade 5. So I hear you conflating Perkins criteria with criteria for these programs, but if the purpose of Perkins even is to become more expansive in who participates in programs that are funded by these funds. So my preferred way of looking at this data and my preference and what the purpose of collecting this data would be is to make sure that we are selecting data points that counts the largest number of CTE students, not just pathways participants or pathways completers. So that's me, and I'll stop talking because that's my opinion as it relates to all of the recommendations. I think they're too narrow, that it's changing the intent of the legislation away from CTE and to favor schools that have pathways, and that will eliminate the successful competition for other districts that don't have these particular pathways programs. And that's a concern of mine, that if we put these recommendations up as recommendations to change the legislation, we're actually changing the actual legislative intent behind why these particular grants were created in the first place. So that's how I feel, and I will just stop talking altogether.
Member Rocky, your point is well taken. I mean, I think that's a very valid point that we should take into consideration. And so it may be that by making the recommendation on changing on recommendation 1, I think it sort of makes the other recommendations that follow as in terms of how we collect that data, because your recommendation is to expand the denominator, and then we collect those in the numerator as is, with some of the options that were presented to you.
Yeah, and frankly, I did not understand that recommendation 1 by choosing the concentrator versus pathway, that we were narrowing the number of students that we're talking about that these funds should be going to. I was looking at it as, hey, a successful program would increase numbers of students in those areas, but not focus these funds on that. That is just, it is conflating the whole Perkins definition with what the intent of these two programs are. So if that is the lens from which the staff has been making these recommendations, then I do think we probably need to rethink this.
Chair Sun, actually, I was going from the recommendation that or the discussion we had when we talked about the federal accountability plan, and trying to link the information that is available within our California School Dashboard as well as the CCI. So that's where I was going. I was just saying, so that wasn't, I was not thinking about the Perkins lens at all. I was actually thinking more in terms of how we generally collect information within the CCI and the California School Dashboard.
Yeah, and I think that is what we want to do. We want to take information data that's already collected, because it will better inform us what is happening with these funds, right? And the makeup of the students who are in these CTE programs. I'm not sure if we need to go. So I'm a little bit confused now whether we need to go back to these recommendations. We need to make changes, because we're really relying on staff to let us know how.
Right. So Ting,
yeah.
I'm sorry. This is Michelle, and I can really see where this gets very, very confusing, because really, when the legislation was put together, these data points, these data metrics were based on what was in Perkins. They didn't necessarily fit the CTEIG program specifically, right? So these were originally taken from Perkins. And I think over the years, what we've tried to do is say, okay, where they would work with Perkins, that might work in some cases, but My argument has been that maybe that these metrics don't necessarily reflect this particular program, right? And so to where we can somehow bring those two together, and it may be really that we need to look at this more from a CTEIG program perspective versus that original Perkins language that was inserted. Because remember, if we go back and we look at it, we said, well, we had to update the matrix to then include the new Perkins 5 measures. And I think the intent there was to do something so that we didn't have all these different measures that we were looking at, but to closely align them. But it may be where we need to look at what those Perkins measures are, like what, how those fit, and if they don't fit, and then what is more appropriate for this particular program. And I can see in this area where I certainly understand where Member Rucker's coming from with looking at the broader number of CTE students overall. And then once we have that broader number, we can always then narrow it down to look at pathway completers as well. So I just think that maybe just kind of understanding where it kind of came from and where we're at might kind of help move us forward.
Yeah. I agree. And I'm thinking that when we make recommendations to these metrics, right now the metrics and the metrics that were in Perkins, it's very static. It's what Pradeep said, Dr. Gurmaju, said, is just give us the facts, right? Here's the facts. But it doesn't, we get some numbers, but what is it actually doing? Are we moving the needle? And maybe that's what we need to do is when we're looking at recommendations of the metric, that we need to look at ways that we're moving the needle. And that would be the change. And ways that we're moving the needle could be operationalized in specific data that's collected to see the before and after. But it's not, I don't think we should be tweaking the legislation to change it to different static metrics, or static information. Because I think we're just kind of moving the shell game around a little bit rather than really looking at, are we really making movement status? So I think that's maybe the approach that we want to take a look at. Okay, so I'm very confident we still have an item and we are past a break time. And I'm kind of uncertain. What we might want to do is, I recommend that we do, how many more recommendations do we have?
There's 7 and 8 where there's no change in the metrics.
Okay. So we have 7 and 8, and those are just not, they're not even asking for recommendation changes, right?
So
no change to the metric.
If I put the recommendation summary out, is really looking at the first one where that is the discussion we have, Member Rucker put forward, is to just have a more expansive definition of number of pupils engaged in CTE, for example.
Yeah.
And then using that as the denominator, trying to collect the information that's there on the remaining bullets on that slide. And then if you go to the next one, is using, that's where the definition is operationalizing college and career readiness or assessment scores. I think I heard that we would end up using the college and career readiness, although that creates an issue now if we have a more expansive definition, because that's something that we can collect that information, but either way we can get that information, but it requires an additional step on the part of the accountability to do that. We can obviously get the assessment scores for any student that's engaged in CTE, and then no change to the metrics in terms of these 5 that are listed there.
Yeah. Okay. So my sense based on this conversation, and I'm happy to hear any members who might not, who are totally anxious and ready to take action on this. I think that we're not ready to take action on these recommendations, and would like staff to go back and based on our feedback, think a little bit more about it. I would like to take public comment after we take a 10-minute break and take public comment on this item, and then move to our next item next item 3 after that. So with that, let's take a 10-minute break. So it's 2:24. Please come back at 2:34, and then 2:34, and then we will take public comment on this item. Okay? All right. Thanks, everyone. All right, very good. Well, welcome back, everyone. We are on item 2, and we are on public comment for item 2. If those of you who wish to address the committee with a comment on this item, the way you can do that by going through Zoom, email, or phone number that is displayed right now on the screen.
And Chair Sun, I think we need to take attendance because we took a break to make sure we have quorum.
Great, thank you. We'll do a quick roll call then. Thank you for the reminder.
Chair Sun?
Here.
Vice Chair Grande?
Here.
Member McQuillan?
Very good. Here.
I'm trying. Member Rawlings?
I'm here.
Member Rucker?
Here.
Ex officio member McGuire?
I'm here.
And ex officio member Rattray?
Here.
Awesome. Chair Sun, do you want me to go ahead and start with public comment since I know we have a few?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay, the first comment we have is from Mary Whited from Merced County Office of Education Regional Occupational Program. She states, thank you for this opportunity to expand and grow our CTE pathways. Our consortium has been able to start and maintain great additions to several of our pathways utilizing both CTEIG and K-12 Strong Workforce Program funds. It would be very helpful, given the short timeline, if the K-12 Strong Workforce Program FAQ were updated to include the Bidders Conference, NOVA Platform Applicant Training, regional engagement meetings, and questions entered through K-12 SWP at cccco.edu. Confusion exists in the field on the few issues that are not clear in the RFA and in some cases contradictory within the RFA. The issues need a consistent answer to ensure that applications are submitted aligned to the intention of the grant. Second public comment is from Janice Rogg, also from Merced County Office of Education Regional Occupation Program. Some confusion exists regarding responsibility on who reports interim and ongoing survey data. In our area, the consortium LEA handling the program and fiscal aspects of the grant is operated under ROCPs, who employ teachers and support staff and run CTE courses on the campuses of school districts where ADA is collected for these students by individual districts. We understand that schools will be reporting through CalPADS and CalPAS for their pathway students, but we need to clarify that the lead LEA is responsible for interim data survey reporting, working with each partner, instead of the individual partners also being required to report via a survey. Clarification is needed so that our consortium members are not in jeopardy of being awarded additional funds in the future based on an incorrect assumption. And then our final comment is from Clinton Maxwell from Mendocino County Office of Education. He is a specialist, and he states that CTE participants captures the outputs of the system. CTE Completers captures the transformative outcomes. We have many students that take multiple pathways before the student schedule limits them to commit to one pathway. This is especially true for A through G students. They start many pathways, but don't finish them because they have to complete their A through G courses as a priority. Only some of the CTE courses are also A through G approved. Thank you. And that concludes public comment at this time.
Okay, and we don't have anyone who is calling in, right?
No, that was through email and through Zoom.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you. So this concludes the public comment for item 2. Now we want to go back. I had stated before we went on break, based on some of the conversation, I'm not feeling that we are ready to take action today on staff recommendation to the matrix of metrics. And I just wanted to get here if there are any members who disagree. All right, I am not seeing any members who disagree, so I will go ahead and just provide direction to staff to bring the recommendations or to have some conversations and then bring the recommendations back for our November meeting of any changes we want to make to the legislation for CTEIG and for the strong workforce. All right, and then any other just direction to staff before we move on to the next item? Okay.
I'm not seeing.
Yeah, I am not seeing any either. All right, so then we are ready for item 3, an update of the California State Plan for Career Technical Education. And this is being presented by Shinhui Weber, Vice Chancellor, Workforce and Economic Development Division of the Community College Chancellor's Office.
Good afternoon, Chair Sun, Vice Chair Grande, members and colleagues. I'm Shani Weber. I am the Vice Chancellor for Workforce and Economic Development at the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. Item 3 is to provide an update on the progress of the work of the state plan for CTE. Next slide, please. This is going to be a quick review of what is covered in this presentation. We're providing an update on the strategic plan, the call to action development, including consideration of ongoing and emerging issues, how the proposed strategic area of focus and the way it's going to be organized, looking at the timeline horizon and obtaining your feedback. Next slide, please. Much of this presentation is really a recap of the context and framing, so I will try to get through it quickly to get to the main part of the presentation. Next slide, please. As you may recall, at the July meeting, our last meeting, staff presented to the committee the approach and the fashioning of how we're going to fashion the state plan for career technical education, similar to a strategic plan or call to action. To recap very briefly, the last state plan for CTE was published in 2008. And fast forward to the development of the Perkins 5 federal application round, which started about over a year ago. In that process, last November, the committee made a decision to separate the development of Perkins 5 federal application from the state plan for CTE to allow for more thoughtful development of the state plan and to facilitate the ability to meet the U.S. Department of Education application deadline in April of this year, which was later extended to June due to the pandemic. The California state team that you're seeing here called CAST was established in November of 2019. And this was a result of the team attending an advanced CTE summit of the Perkins 5 plan development for states. This team consists of, Dr. Kodam Raju, Michelle McIntosh, representing the California Department of Education. It also recently joined by Deputy Superintendent Kendra Britt. And then on the Chancellor's Office side, it's represented by myself and Assistant Vice Chancellor Sandra Sanchez, as well as Dean Jeff Merizic. Next slide, please. As the state team continue work on the state plan for CTE, we're always mindful of the following goals. At the core, of course, is the student-centered approach. And then the plan that also encourages and drives innovation to transform CTE programs, with employer participation and engagement being key to good career pathways and jobs for students. Next slide, please. Of course, the guiding policy principles that's all we're all familiar with and near and dear to all of us is all encompassing in this work that we're doing. Alignment with the state's workforce development strategies that includes the discussions at the Governor's Office Future Work Commission, the Labor Agency, the California Workforce Development Board and their high road training partnerships, the Strong Workforce Plan 25 recommendations, as well as looking at the data on equities and including looking at low participation rates of African American students that was raised at our last meeting. This is all encompassing and includes the work of the Perkins 5 application as part of the component of the state plan for CTE. Next slide, please. Other issues we're also taking into consideration as we do this work includes looking at organizing our work, not just to increase alignment between the two systems, but also looking at industry sectors and regional alignments. Another part of this is the measurement and accountability. People care about what's being measured, and work continues in aligning the metrics, the definition, how we collect the data, as we have heard in the earlier discussion in item 2. Next slide, please. These are all topics that we're all familiar with, the teacher preparation and qualifications issues, to talk about increasing dual and concurrent enrollment continues to be a nut that we have to crack, which would propel systems alignment. Expanding work-based learning is another key that would result in better prepared students to enter employment. Next slide, please. Additionally, there's really been a rich body of work that this committee has undertaken since 2017. And at the July meeting, Member Rattray had recommended that staff review that body of work and the discussion that has occurred since 2017. And staff did a review of the work that was done in that particular round. And based on the review, these are some following areas that we have determined that has emerged that is rather prominent and should be focused on under this changing environment. And those issues are online education, as we have seen with the pandemic, with a lot of, and sort of a huge pivot to online education. Competency-based education has been an emerging topic, not just in the state, but across the country. Credential transparency is increasing an area that is very much coupled with competency-based education, looking at skills clusters and matching skills to job skills that's required for students to be successful in employment. And facilitating education and workforce transitions, looking at how we design those career pathways and increase alignment in those career pathways. Next slide, please. So all of this work is sort of combined and reviewed, and in our initial assessment and based on all of the past discussions, analysis, input, we came to this particular set of, I guess you would call it buckets, 4 major buckets that we're organizing our work into. And this is sort of the approach and the way we want to organize the work for the state plan for CTE. So first, we have the workforce supply that meets demand. And this is looking at, obviously, the employer's needs, the employer engagement, the partnerships, what's in demand skills, where the jobs, growth, and how to supply the demand that's out there. The second part is really about the delivery. How do we deliver the programs and the support services that go with that? And so the delivery would encompass topics like competency-based education, looking at online education, the work-based learning we just talked about, apprenticeship, adult education, and obviously curriculum is a big part of this piece as well. The third bucket or category is about data that informs the investment. So lots of discussion about the common outcomes. What are we trying to measure? How do we tell that we're making progress and achieving the outcomes that we intend to achieve? How do we know there's increased alignment in between the two systems, looking at aligning data systems, and then particularly with the broader idea of capturing data that can tell us more specifically the path from cradle to career as much as possible. The fourth part of bucket or category would be systems alignment. Particularly areas that we would want to look at is dual enrollment, teacher prep. There's a lot of implications in teacher prep and teacher credentialing when it comes to career pathways and the movement of students from the K-12 system into particularly the community college system and other higher ed. Of course, not indicated here, but something that we do really want to explicitly call out and address, and we'll have to build some language around, is the equity and access, diversity, equity, inclusion issue to be interwoven throughout the 4 buckets, the 4 focus areas, rather than making it a separate 5th bucket. The reason that we talked about is that equity really should be infused into everything that we do and not become a separate thing, because then it becomes a separate thing that a separate group is working on, which has the potential of relegating it to the sidelines. But our interest is really making it a central theme to everything that we do. Next slide, please. So as that's the first set of recommendation we're making in terms of how we're organizing and approaching and continuing the work. As this work continues, we will be also reviewing recommendations, of course, from all of the past body of work that's been done, particularly around the areas of importance and focus that members have mentioned in the past meetings. The feedback, obviously, from the key stakeholders and public, the research on promising alignment practices, a lot of this work, taking a lot of this work from the Perkins 5 application process that we went through. Next slide, please. In terms of timeline, what are we looking at with the state plan for CTE? So what really drives us are some external timelines, which is related again to the Perkins 5 plan. So we are due as a state to provide an update to the U.S. Department of Education for the Perkins 5 plan in spring of 2022, which means we are looking at completing a very specific required scope of work by the summer of next year, 2021. That timeline will allow us for time to do another round of key stakeholder input, public comments period in the fall of 2021. Next slide, please. So based on that Perkins 5 update timeline that I just reviewed, we are targeting completing the first draft of the state plan for CTE in the spring of 2021 so that it can also inform the Perkins 5 plan update. Currently, staff is exploring options on how best to approach the scope of work in developing the state plan, including designing and planning of the study sessions discussed at the last meeting in July. And at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Kodamraji to see if there's any additional comments that he would like to add, as well as Deputy Superintendent Kendra Britt as well.
Thank you, Shani. I will defer to Kendra because I'm trying to catch my breath after the last 2 hours. So.
Thanks for the opportunity, Pradeep. I want you to catch your breath there. I know you had a lot to discuss. Hello, everybody. Thank you for including me. I'm looking forward to working on this, and I know we've been in discussion with this and really trying to just make sure we're implementing all the things that have come out of the great discussions prior to me joining this fabulous group. So thank you, Shani, for laying that out. I think we're on the right track, and I appreciate anybody's comments or feedback or insight as we're building this plan. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. So any questions, comments from members?
Member Rucker.
Thank you. Shani, I want to really begin by expressing my appreciation for the time that you invested in putting this briefing together for us, the scope of work and laying out exactly what the plan is and what all is involved in developing this report in a comprehensive and thoughtful way. It always impresses me when I see the level of detail and the level of attention that was paid to being inclusive, not only of stakeholders, but of the multiple entities within the scope of the community college that need to contribute to this report. So I really appreciate what you shared with us today. It helps me to have great faith in the product and the report that we will eventually see, and also the process that other stakeholders will use, particularly moving up from the programs that are touched by the community college to do this. So I wanted to begin there, and I want to be a little expansive and offer this particular piece of advice. As a panel, we're not in the same place that we were when we started all these years, several years ago, with implementing this advisory committee. And I don't believe that the report that will come out of this process is going to look like many of the other reports that have come in the past, or at least I'm hoping it will not look the same way. Because what I'm hoping you will discover, and I'm hoping what the report will show, is that there are a lot of questions now concerning high quality CTE programs and the role of the community college that have surfaced questions that we still need to live with. So I'm hoping in developing this report and in doing the evaluations that your plan has laid out, what I'm hoping is that there will be some unanswered questions, and that the time that will be taken for those unanswered questions will not be try to craft an answer, but to figure out what it means to do the further systemic thinking, system study that will actually at some point lead to an answer. But I'm kind of hoping the report, and I'm forecasting this, or maybe even I'm lobbying for this, I'm hoping the report will say, these are some issues and questions that the system has simply decided to live with. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say that.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Grande.
Thank you so much, Sheni, for giving us an outline of where we're going in terms of the draft of this state plan for career technical education. I am beyond excited to see the outcome of this process. But more than that, I'm wondering about the outcome from the former plan. Is there any source of inspiration that includes a review of the previous plan to see if we've met the outcomes that we set out in 2008? And if they weren't met, do they need to roll over into the new plan? And if so, how we plan to prioritize those, since they have been in a plan of some sort for more than a decade. But more than that, what about lessons learned from drafting our previous plan and the execution of our previous plan that we might be able to bring in to inform the deliberations going forward? So I'd like to see one of the sources of inspiration being the after action report of the 2008 plan, so that we might be able to close the loop on what we said was important in 2008, where we are in 2020, and essentially where we're going probably for at least the next 5 years, probably more than that.
Ex officio member Rattray.
So I have a couple comments, but I do want to just address a comment just made by Jolena too. I think that makes sense, but I would want to just encourage us to keep thinking about the bigger picture. It was Mike Kirst that kind of had the brainchild to recommend that we come into formation. And Mike was reacting both to what you said, Jolena, the ongoing expenditure of Perkins funds, but he was also reacting to $500 million that we had invested in the Career Pathways Trust Fund, the ongoing money that we had spent for many years, or I don't know, decades, on ROCP, and then other related CT investments, with the idea that they weren't coherent and it was hard to tell whether we had been successful across a whole range of these things. So again, I think you're right, but I wouldn't just focus on that Perkins plan. I was actually a part of it. And I think most of us felt like we didn't come out anywhere close to what we wanted. But it was part of the always slip into almost a categorical mentality. We're spending like a piece of funds for a piece of work, and yet there's all these other huge investments we're making and attempting to make, and they're not strategically tied together. So I understand what you're saying, but I would also just encourage us to think larger about a whole set of efforts by California. And just know, I mean, the reason we were asked to come together was because it was deemed as wholly not nearly as effective as we would want it to be. But that's a generalized statement. So a couple of things, first of all, Shani, too, my thanks. I mean, I love the way you've repositioned us now. That's just what we were hoping in the early years of this entity. And so, I would just technically say we didn't really separate the thing back with the Perkins. That was the intent from the beginning, but then we shifted in after we did the principles, we shifted in, let's take care of business on Perkins, but always make sure the higher road of a larger career strategy for the state of California was always our highest calling, you might say. So now we're just sort of ready to get back to the highest calling is what the way I think about it. But anyway, couple things. One is, I'm glad you mentioned competency-based education, and I hope you included in it prior learning competencies, which is such an important derivative of that. I'm sure you would agree, and just didn't mention that. But the other thing I was just going to say is we've, I think, appropriately and naturally focused mostly on the K to 14 pipeline, and yet we all know that community colleges are enormous servers in California of working adults and adults of all ages. And we also know that in this recession, a lot of these jobs are not coming back at all. And we have a crisis in California, like the whole country has. What are we going to do with all these individuals that have lost their job and are not coming back into the economy unless we upskill or reskill them? And we know the community colleges are our best weapon in this state and our best resource to help, especially low-income, low-wealth individuals and many individuals of color that are going to need our help in this coming year or two. And so it just gets me thinking that we don't spend much time in this committee thinking about adult learners and adult workers. And I wonder if we should just make sure that we are doing both. I don't mean instead of, by the way. I think we need to keep doing what we've been doing. But it just seems like we should spend more time on how do we think about career education for the 30 or 40 or 50-year-old that we're going to need to get back into the labor market successfully in this crisis. And then, of course, that's forever, too. I mean, we know that doesn't ever go away.
Very good. Thank you. Any other committee members? Oh, yeah, I just want to also, Shani, thank you so much for putting so much thought into the design of the plan. Clearly, having been in these meetings for a couple years now and hearing the conversations, I felt that your work with the staff in the buckets and the categories of work and the direction that we need to go it covers very well our conversation. So I'm very excited about our work in this area. It is something we've been wanting to get to for a very, very long time. And then it also occurs to me that this conversation we just had around the matrix and metrics, I appreciated this presentation. I almost felt like we needed to have this presentation before we talked about the metrics, because it broadens our vision out now into, okay, what is it that we really want to affect? And there's a plan for where we're going to work on a plan for that. But I think it turns our lens from what currently exists, and let's try to match up match up the goals to what currently exists versus what are our goals, and let's change the system to match those goals. So I thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate the thought that went into it.
Thank you, and I really appreciate all of the members' comments. It's very, very relevant. Member Rattray, the conversation about credit for prior learning and competency-based education and adult learners is something that's occurring with great focus at the community college level. That is something that we're very much focused on, and also in terms of the data, looking at what data is relevant. And I believe that there's a big role that the adult education program can play. That's something that we have very much in common. That needs to be really integrated into this work. I think the biggest challenge for us is really the data piece. The sharing of the data, the aligning of the data, and how we track the students from high school into community colleges and beyond. We have control over the high school piece between the two systems and the community colleges, and we have information about and beyond from the community college perspective. I think the challenge is how to all put it together and what's meaningful, and ultimately what we've learned is that people care about what we measure, so we have to be very thoughtful about what are we measuring and what we want it, what would tell us that we're actually being effective. So thank you. I appreciate all your comments, and we will continue to provide updates to you as we progress in this work.
Thank you so much. So if I'm not seeing any additional comments from members, we will go to public comment on this item. And again, you have on your screen different ways that you can provide your public comment on item 3.
Our first public comment is from Kyle Highland. He is from the Career Technical Education Joint Powers Authority Coalition. His comment is, the Career Technical Education Joint Powers Authority Coalition is an organization comprised of 13 CTE JPAs who represent 60 school districts that provide high-quality CTE programs to California students. Our comments today are a synopsis of a letter that was sent to committee and staff earlier this week, where we offer 2 recommendations for the state's comprehensive state plan for CTE. When considering the narrative around Essential Element 5, we believe the state plan should explicitly highlight the importance of complying with Title V regulations as it prescribes the standards and operations guidelines for work experience education programs. This includes the requirement to submit an operational plan to CDE that shows how the programs combine the necessary on-the-job experience and related classroom instruction in order to maximize the value of these work experience opportunities for students. We worry that without this specifically calling out Title V in the state plan, LEAs could inadvertently not follow the requirements stipulated by these regulations, which could jeopardize the safety of students and staff, as well as relationships with industry partners. For Essential Element 6, we believe there should be language highlighting that CTE teachers are required to possess a CTE credential. The state has determined that properly credentialed CTE teachers are a critical component of high-quality CTE programs, and detailing this requirement in the state plan recognizes and values the importance of teachers that have not only the industry knowledge, but also the pedagogical skills. Our CTEIG and regional occupational centers and programs pride ourselves on employing teachers that are experts in their industry and are able to convey this knowledge and training to their students because of their academic skills obtained through their CTE credential. We thank you for considering our recommendations, and we look forward to working with you on the state plan moving forward. And that is all the public comment we have at this time.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Lisa. All right, so thank you for the public who have come in and commented on all of the items today. We have one final item, which is general public comment. So at this point, I'd like to invite anyone who has general public comment. And again,
I just wanted to mention and have it on the record that there was a letter that was shared with members this morning that was submitted last week that last commenter referenced on the work experience education and CTE teacher credentialing.
Very good. Thank you. Do we have anyone for general public comment?
That is all we have at this time.
Okay, very good. So no more on general public comment. So given that we have, we're at the end of our items. Given our items, I mean, I feel, first of all, thank you to the staff for all their preparation. We have evolved, I think, quite a bit in our meetings and our conversations. And staff, thank you for getting the information out and for the agenda items to us in a manner that we could actually look through a lot of the information prior to it. So thank you very much for the preparation. We will. We did not take action on item 2 with regard to the matrix of metrics. But we will take that up at our next meeting. And our next meeting is November 20th at 10:30 a.m. And of course, it will still be distance at that time as well. So if there's no other comments, I will go ahead and adjourn our meeting. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you all for your participation and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Great job, Jane.
Bye-bye.